Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Story 1: Cuneiform, the accountants of Uruk. You are walking through the low hum of ancient Uruk. It is not the kind of place one might expect to change the course of human communication. The streets are dusty. The buildings are made of mud brick. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flow not far from here, and their seasonal rhythms define the pace of life. But nestled between their fertile banks, a quiet revolution is taking place, one that will leave behind thousands of clay tablets, baked in the sun and forgotten in storerooms for thousands of years. Welcome to southern Mesopotamia. It is around 3300 BCE. You are standing at the very beginning of writing. The need for order in an unruly world. In Uruk, things are getting complicated. The fields are large, and the harvests are plentiful, too plentiful to remember everything by heart. Goats, grain, beer, textiles, fish, copper, labor, so much is moving through the temples and storehouses that oral memory alone can no longer serve. The problem is mundane but pressing. People need a way to track things. So they begin marking clay, first with pictograms, simple shapes for objects, a fish for fish, a bowl for food, a circle with spokes for the sun. Tokens had been used before, small clay pieces representing different goods, but they were limited. Now, someone has the idea to press these images directly into wet clay. It seems like a small gesture, but it's revolutionary. The temple economy and the rise of scribes. The early writing of Uruk was not literary. It was not poetic. It was not meant for entertainment. It was bureaucratic. Temples functioned as the economic centers of the city-state. They were not just religious hubs, but collection and redistribution points. Workers were paid in rations. Goods were brought in from surrounding fields. Artisans required materials. Priests oversaw much of it, but it was the scribes, the quiet accountants of the ancient world, who made the whole thing work. Their tools were simple: a reed stylus, clay, and careful hands. With a stylus cut at an angle, they pressed wedge-shaped impressions into the clay. Over time, these marks became more abstract and systematized. The word cuneiform literally means wedge-shaped, in Latin, a name given millennia later by archaeologists. The earliest known script, called proto-cuneiform, was mostly numbers and commodity symbols. A line and a circle meant 60. A fish symbol meant, well, fish. But soon, things got more complex. When symbols began to speak. At some point, perhaps around 3000 BCE, someone decided to record not just what but who. They needed names. This changed everything. Because how do you write Enlil Bani, the barley keeper? A symbol for barley is easy enough, but what about Enlil and Bani? The scribes began to use phonetic values, syllables, and sounds rather than just pictures. Suddenly, writing wasn't just about counting, it could represent language. This shift took generations. It was gradual and somewhat messy. The clay tablets from this period are filled with revisions, corrections, scribal notes, and the slow evolution of signs into a recognizable script. But by the mid-3rd millennium BCE, true cuneiform writing had emerged. Learning to write, the Edubba. If you wanted to become a scribe, you went to the Edubba, the tablet house. It was less romantic than it sounds. The training was tedious, repetitive, and strict. You would begin by copying simple lists: birds, animals, fish, tools. Then move on to verb forms and numerical systems. The teacher, often an older scribe, might beat you with a stick if your wedge wasn't sharp enough or your lines were uneven. Clay doesn't lie. Mistakes are permanent. The tablets used in training were typically dried, not fired, and reused by erasing the surface with water. The really important documents, contracts, temple receipts, legal decisions, were fired or sun-dried to last. Some of these training tablets survive today, their corners bearing the fingerprints of nervous students. The bureaucratic world of grain and goats. So what did these early scribes actually write? Not epic poetry, not yet. The earliest examples of written narrative come centuries later. Instead, most surviving tablets are as thrilling as an office spreadsheet. Receipts, inventories, loan agreements, work assignments, and ration lists. 5 gur of barley delivered to Akil the brewer from the storehouse of Inanna. Date, month of the festival. Ration lists are particularly common. A laborer might be paid in barley or beer, typically about 1 liter per day. Women and children often received half rations. The tablets recorded everything, down to absurdly small details. In the temples, scribes maintained master lists of everything. How many goats were given to the temple, how much wool each weaver produced, how many bricks were required for construction. If something wasn't recorded, it might as well not have happened. This was writing for survival, economic survival, administrative survival, political survival. Without it, there was chaos. Not just numbers, the beginning of titles and myths. Yet even amid this sea of paperwork, glimmers of narrative began to appear. By around 2600 BCE, scribes started recording royal titles and deeds. Kings needed propaganda. Temples needed hymns. Stories, too, became tools of power. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the earliest surviving literary works, has its roots in this period, though the fully developed text would not appear until later. Names of gods, rulers, and places began appearing with increasing frequency. Myths were compiled. Incantations were written. The sacred and the mundane blurred on clay. But still, even in its early days, the bulk of writing was deeply, deeply boring. And that is its charm. Because in these dry, cracked tablets we see real people with real needs trying to control an uncontrollable world. A world encased in mud. Thousands of these tablets have been discovered, many in ancient storerooms, some seemingly untouched since antiquity. They tell of shipments, of dates. They record disputes over land boundaries. They describe temple donations and list household slaves. They are records of lives long forgotten, made permanent through dust and discipline. And yet, for all their detail, they are silent on the feelings of their writers. What did the scribe feel as he pressed his stylus into clay for the 100th time that day? Did he know that his work would outlast empires? We can only guess. And so the question remains, why did these anonymous scribes, armed with nothing but reed and clay, persist for centuries in this methodical, meticulous record-keeping? What drove such consistency? And why did their system spread so widely across the Near East? The sun has not yet risen over Mesopotamia, but the scribes are already awake. In the dim light of flickering oil lamps, they press styluses into wet clay, their movements deliberate and efficient. The work is not glamorous, and yet it is essential. This writing, this system, has become the scaffolding upon which civilization rests. We move beyond Uruk to follow the journey of cuneiform as it outgrows its origins. From a local record-keeping tool, it evolves into the script of empires, diplomacy, and international trade. It spreads across lands, languages, and cultures, becoming quietly one of the most influential inventions in human history. From Uruk to Akkad, scaling the system. By the time Sargon of Akkad rises to power in the 24th century BCE, cuneiform has been fully standardized. The signs have become more abstract, and the writing more versatile. No longer just a tool of city-states like Uruk or Lagash, cuneiform becomes the language of empire. Sargon unifies a broad swath of Mesopotamia under the Akkadian Empire, arguably the world's first empire, and with it, the cuneiform script spreads as a means of control. Interestingly, the Akkadians do discard the Sumerian writing system. Instead, they adapt it to their own Semitic language. This is important. It marks one of the first times a script is used to write a different language from the one that invented it. Akkadian cuneiform expands the script's use beyond temple economy into royal decrees, military commands, religious hymns, and law. Under Sargon and his descendants, archives grow larger, bureaucracies denser, and scribal work more essential than ever. The birth of legal texts, Hammurabi's Code. Perhaps the most iconic example of cuneiform's administrative power comes in the 18th century BCE with Hammurabi of Babylon. You may have heard of him not because of his conquests, but because of his laws. The Code of Hammurabi is one of the earliest known examples of written law. Inscribed in cuneiform on a tall basalt stele, the code outlines over 280 laws covering trade, labor, property, marriage, theft, and even malpractice. Some are surprisingly specific. If a builder constructs a house for a man but does not make his work strong, and the house collapses and kills the owner, the builder shall be put to death. It's harsh, yes, but also fascinatingly methodical. These laws weren't just symbolic, they were publicly displayed and intended to standardize justice. The use of cuneiform here reflects a key shift. Writing is now being used not just to track goods or glorify kings, but to shape society itself. Multilingual and multinational, the scribal class. By 1500 BCE, cuneiform had become the lingua franca of the ancient Near East. Even as new kingdoms rose and fell, the script remained. From the Hittites in Anatolia to the Elamites in Persia, and even as far as Ugarit on the Levanten coast, variations of cuneiform appeared, each one adapted to local tongues. This created a class of highly trained scribes who often worked across cultures. To be a scribe was to be part of an elite, transnational profession. It required years of training, absolute precision, and the ability to navigate complex political and linguistic systems. Diplomatic tablets from the Amarna letters found in Egypt but written in Akkadian cuneiform reveal a world where kings exchanged formal communications across vast distances. Treaties, marriage negotiations, and trade agreements were all written in this shared script. Even pharaohs like Akhenaten used cuneiform to communicate with Babylon, Assyria, and the Hittites. In short, cuneiform became the first international bureaucratic standard. Archives in clay, the libraries of the Bronze Age. All of this required infrastructure, archives, libraries, and vast storerooms of tablets. Across Mesopotamia and beyond, great collections of clay documents were amassed. Cities like Mari, Ebla, and Nineveh housed thousands of texts, most of them routine, but some historically monumental. One of the most famous collections came from the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, 7th century BCE. Ashurbanipal, king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, fancied himself a scholar and ordered the collection of texts from across Mesopotamia. His library held over 30,000 tablets, including mythological epics, legal codes, medical treatises, and astronomical records. Among these was the most complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story that began as oral tradition in Sumer and was written, refined, and preserved over centuries. It was inscribed, as always, in cuneiform. Cuneiform in daily life. But cuneiform was not just for kings and priests. In urban centers like Nippur or Sippar, everyday people engaged with the script. Contracts for marriage, property sales, loans, and even school assignments have been found in private collections. One tablet from a small village reads, "To my brother send me fish and beer, do not forget the garlic, Zimri." It's a grocery list, written in the same script used for royal edicts and epic poetry. There are even clay letters written between family members, lovers, and soldiers on campaign. One particularly poignant letter from a father to his son reads, "Why have you not written me? Are you ill? Do you need silver? Do not shame me before the scribes." We hear echoes of modern anxieties, distant children, unanswered messages, the pressure of public perception. The tools of the trade. The act of writing cuneiform was physically demanding. Clay tablets had to be the right consistency, not too wet, not too dry. Styluses, typically made of reed, needed to be sharp and durable. Mistakes could not easily be erased. The tablets were typically rectangular or pillow-shaped. Important records were sometimes sealed in clay envelopes complete with a copy inside, in case the outer layer was broken. Some documents were even notarized with cylinder seals, tiny carved stones rolled over the wet clay to imprint images and signatures. These tools created a world in which nothing was ephemeral. Even the most mundane transaction was literally set in stone, or rather, in clay. The slow decline. For over 3,000 years, cuneiform thrived. But by the end of the first millennium BCE, its use had diminished significantly. Why? Several reasons. The rise of alphabetic scripts like Aramaic and Phoenician made writing more accessible. With fewer characters and simpler shapes, alphabetic scripts required less training. Political shifts, including the fall of Assyria and Babylon and the rise of Persian, Greek, and Roman powers, marginalized Mesopotamian institutions. The clay medium was being replaced by papyrus and parchment, in many areas easier to carry, write on, and store. By the time Alexander the Great marched into Babylon in 331 BCE, only a handful of scribes still knew the old ways. The script survived in temple contexts for a few more centuries, but eventually faded into complete obscurity. The last known dated cuneiform tablet is from 75 CE, written over 3,000 years after the first symbols were scratched into Uruk's clay. Silence and rediscovery. And then for almost 2,000 years, cuneiform was silent, forgotten, unreadable. The clay tablets lay buried in the ruins of forgotten cities: Nippur, Sippar, Babylon, waiting for someone to care again. When European explorers began excavating the Near East in the 19th century, they brought back thousands of tablets to museums in London, Paris, and Berlin. But what did they say? The code was broken only through painstaking comparison of multiple versions of the same text. Scholars like Henry Rawlinson risked their lives to copy inscriptions from the cliffs of Behistun in Persia, where a multilingual inscription in Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian eventually unlocked the cuneiform script. The decipherment of cuneiform was one of the great intellectual triumphs of the 19th century, and when the tablets were finally read, they revealed a civilization far more detailed, complex, and literate than anyone had imagined. And yet the question lingers. Why, after so many millennia of function and utility, did cuneiform vanish so completely? What does this say about the fragility of knowledge and the impermanence of even our most deeply ingrained systems? The ruins of Babylon are quiet now. The wind rustles through the broken bricks and toppled walls. The Euphrates has long since shifted its course. But buried deep beneath the dust, baked in the sun and stored in the dark, tens of thousands of clay tablets remain silent witnesses to a civilization that trusted in wedges, clay, and memory. This is the afterlife of cuneiform, a script that once held the full weight of economic records, diplomacy, law, science, and myth. Now we examine what was left behind, what was forgotten, and what the rediscovery of cuneiform taught us, not just about ancient Mesopotamia, but about ourselves. The script fades from living memory. By the time the Roman Empire was in its ascendancy, no one could read cuneiform. It had survived millennia, weathered empires, and adapted to different languages. But around the 1st century CE, it fell completely out of use. Not gradually, it disappeared. Why? The reasons were largely practical. Medium mismatch. Clay tablets were durable but heavy and inflexible. They were ideal for temple archives, less so for portable writing. Cultural turnover. As Zoroastrian, Hellenistic, and later Christian institutions rose in the region, older temple systems declined. Linguistic shifts. Languages like Greek, Aramaic, and eventually Arabic took over commerce, scholarship, and law. And with that, the scribes, those elite preservers of tradition, lost their place in society. Without them, the script lost its function. There were no final ceremonies, no written epitaph for cuneiform. It simply stopped being taught, and like any language without learners, it faded. For nearly 2,000 years, the world forgot how to read it. The tablets beneath the sand. But the script itself did not vanish. The clay tablets endured. In the 19th century, explorers, archaeologists, and treasure hunters, many motivated more by imperial rivalry than academic curiosity, began digging in the Near East. What they found was astonishing. Cities like Nineveh, Lagish, and Babylon yielded vast troves of tablets. Many were broken. Some were beautifully preserved. To most of these early discoverers, the markings were mysterious scratches, clearly systematic, but unreadable. Museums across Europe raced to acquire them. Some collectors even used tablets as doorstops or decorative curiosities, unaware of their historical value. But a few scholars believed these marks could be deciphered. The Great Decipherment. The breakthrough came in stages. Early hints came from trilingual inscriptions, like those at Persepolis, and the Behistun inscription, a kind of Mesopotamian Rosetta Stone. At Behistun, carved into a cliff face in what is now western Iran, an inscription commissioned by Darius the Great, c. 520 BCE, appeared in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform. A British officer named Henry Rawlinson risked his life climbing the cliff face to copy the symbols. Old Persian, written in a simpler cuneiform variant, was the key. Once scholars cracked it, they could use it to work backward into the more complex Akkadian signs. By the 1850s, teams in Europe had successfully deciphered large portions of the script. In a test of accuracy, scholars were asked to translate the same tablet independently. Their translations matched cuneiform had been read for the first time in nearly 2 millennia. Rediscovering ancient voices. What the translations revealed was more than scholars had dared to hope. Cuneiform was not just the script of dusty account books. It held myths, epics, hymns, medical treatises, love letters, astronomical tables, omens, debates, and educational exercises. The Epic of Gilgamesh, a story of kingship, friendship, gods, and the search for immortality. The Enuma Elish, a Babylonian creation myth that begins with a formless sea and ends with the rise of Marduk. Legal codes, including those older than Hammurabi's. Diaries of eclipses, dreams, and rituals. Tables of square roots, multiplication, and the Pythagorean theorem centuries before Pythagoras. We learned that the people of Mesopotamia wondered about the stars, feared death, mourned their children, argued over land, loved their gods, and wrote about all of it in a script of wedges on clay. The mathematics of the wedge. One particularly fascinating area was mathematics. The scribes of ancient Babylon had a complex sexagesimal base 60 system. This base 60 logic is still with us today in how we measure time: 60 seconds, 60 minutes, and angles, 360 degrees. Cuneiform tablets contain sophisticated calculations. Tables of reciprocals and squares. Solutions to quadratic equations. Geometric calculations. Even a clay tablet, known as Plimpton 322, that lays out Pythagorean triples, evidence of trigonometric reasoning 1,000 years before the Greeks. All of this was encoded in cuneiform, on palm-sized tablets baked in Mesopotamian sun. Literature and dust, the human side. Beyond the mathematics, there were deeply human texts. One tablet contains a letter from a student to his mother. Send me more clothes and shoes. Also send my silver ring and more writing boards, and please send me my lunch. Another features a teacher scolding a lazy pupil. You did not write your tablet, you did not come to school, you roamed the streets, you played with the boys. In these glimpses, we see that scribes were not just bureaucrats. They were students, sons, teachers, poets, and thinkers. Their wedge marks captured the whole range of human experience, not just the high politics of kings. The irony of immortality. Ironically, the most durable legacy of the Mesopotamian scribes came not from their mythic tales or grand decrees, but from the sheer boringness of their work. Because they wrote everything, every receipt, every loan, every delivery of grain, we now know more about daily life in ancient Mesopotamia than we do about many later civilizations. Their obsession with documentation gave them a kind of immortality. The temple that once stood is gone, the city walls have crumbled, but the ration list survives. We know what people were paid, what they owed, how much wool a weaver produced in a season, who borrowed what from whom. These details may seem trivial, but they are what allow us to reconstruct real lives, lived thousands of years ago. What cuneiform left behind? Even though the script itself died, its cultural impact did not. The idea of written law seen first in cuneiform endured and shaped modern legal traditions. Bureaucratic record-keeping influenced later administrative systems, from the Persians to the Romans and beyond. The alphabetic scripts that replace cuneiform owe a debt to the earlier desire to record language in written form. Mathematical and astronomical methods from Babylon informed Hellenistic science and, later, Islamic and European scholarship. In some ways, the scribes of Uruk set in motion the very concept of civilization as we know it, a world recorded, remembered, and archived. Clay memory and digital parallels. Today, we might marvel at how these fragile clay tablets lasted for millennia, while our digital records risk disappearing with a corrupted hard drive or obsolete file format. There is a lesson here. The Mesopotamians did not invent writing for art or expression. They did it because they needed to remember, to track, to administer. Their system was resilient not because it was poetic, but because it was useful. In a world of rapid technological change, perhaps the most enduring records are still the simplest, the ones written in clay. And so we ask finally, if today's systems were to vanish, what records would survive us? Would our histories be preserved in the stories we tell or in the spreadsheets we leave behind? Story 2. Hieroglyphs and the Priests of the Nile. You are standing before a wall of stone, cold, unyielding, ancient. It rises above your head, its surface etched with delicate shapes, birds in mid-flight, open palms, coiled ropes, seated gods, baskets, and eyes. The symbols are precise yet enigmatic, arranged in neat columns and rows. The wall is silent, but if you knew how to read it, you would find it speaking across the millennia. This is ancient Egypt, and this is hieroglyphic writing, the sacred script of the Nile. Before alphabets, before the printing press, and long before keyboards, the Egyptians carved meaning into stone, painted it onto tomb walls, and inked it on papyrus scrolls. Their script was not just a tool for communication, it was believed to be magic, a form of divine speech. In this section, we explore the origins of hieroglyphs, the people who created them, and the sacred burden of writing in a civilization obsessed with eternity. The origins of a sacred script. Hieroglyphs appeared around 3200 BCE in Upper Egypt, nearly contemporaneous with the emergence of cuneiform in Mesopotamia. But unlike cuneiform's wedge-shaped pragmatism, Egyptian hieroglyphs emerged with a strong aesthetic and religious sensibility. The earliest inscriptions are found on ceremonial artifacts, not accounting ledgers. These include labels on pottery, ivory tags used for tomb goods, and rock carvings near the first cataract of the Nile. Their earliest purpose seems to be ritual or dynastic, not economic. Egyptian belief held that language was a gift from the gods specifically, the ibis-headed deity Thoth, god of wisdom, writing, and time. Thoth didn't just invent writing, he created it to allow humans to record divine truth. Thus, writing was seen as a divine function, and hieroglyphs were the words of the gods, medunetcher. From the beginning, this script carried religious weight. What is a hieroglyph? The term hieroglyph comes from Greek, hieros sacred and glyphine to carve. To the Greeks, these were sacred carvings, and indeed the Egyptians used three types of script in tandem. Hieroglyphic, used on tombs, monuments, and religious texts, highly pictorial and formal. Hieratic, a cursive, simplified script used by priests and scribes for everyday documents. Demotic, even more cursive and abstract, used in later periods for administrative and legal texts. But hieroglyphs, the formal, sacred script, remain the most visually rich and symbolically charged. Each hieroglyph could function as a logogram, representing a whole word or idea, a phonogram, representing a sound or syllable, a determinative, a non-spoken symbol that clarified meaning. For example, a hieroglyph of a foot might be used to write the word to go, or just to represent the sound be. A sun disk might mean day, or might simply represent the phonetic syllable ra. Thus, hieroglyphs operated in a layered, often ambiguous way rich in puns, double meanings, and symbolic associations. Deciphering them was never simple, even for Egyptians. The role of the scribe. In Egypt, to be a scribe was to hold power. Scribes were not mere secretaries. They were educated elites, often attached to temple bureaucracies, royal courts, and state offices. They recorded taxes, composed religious texts, oversaw construction projects, and chronicled royal achievements. Training as a scribe began in childhood, usually for boys from well-off or priestly families. Lessons were taught in the house of life, part temple school, part library. Pupils copied out standard texts, practiced their signs, and memorized classic works like the Instructions of Tahotep, a didactic guide to wise living. One copybook reads, "A scribe does not go out in the sun. He does not plow or reap. His hands are soft. He is the master of all trades." It was considered a desirable career, one of comfort, prestige, and crucially, literacy in a world where most could not read. Writing materials, from stone to papyrus. While hieroglyphs were most famously carved in stone, particularly for monumental and religious purposes, most writing occurred on papyrus. Papyrus sheets made from the pressed stalks of the papyrus plant were lightweight, portable, and ideal for ink. Scribes used reed pens dipped in carbon-based black ink or iron oxide red ink. They carried these tools in wooden pallets, some of which have survived, still stained with ancient ink. In religious settings, however, writing remained ceremonial. Carving hieroglyphs into stone was a sacred act. Each sign was drawn with care, proportions regulated by canon. The order of glyphs could be reversed for artistic symmetry, but the text still made sense to those who knew the code. Often, signs considered dangerous like snakes or scorpions were drawn incomplete or intentionally broken, so they could not come alive in the afterlife. Because to the Egyptians, words had power, writing something made it real. Tombs, temples, and the afterlife. Nowhere was the power of writing more apparent than in the tomb. Hieroglyphs filled tomb walls from floor to ceiling. Prayers, spells, offering formulas, names, titles, genealogies. Most important were the pyramid texts, later followed by the coffin texts and the Book of the Dead, collections of spells designed to help the deceased navigate the perils of the underworld. O Osiris, rise up, shake off your dust. Your bones are whole again, your heart beats, you have not died. These texts weren't just decorative, they were functional. Hieroglyphs served as magical software, enabling the deceased to pass through judgment, evade demons, and achieve eternal life. The mere presence of a name carefully written in a cartouche, a protective oval, ensured that the deceased would not be forgotten. To erase a name was to erase a person's soul. This is why damnatio memoriae, the erasure of a king's name, was considered the ultimate punishment. In this way, writing was life insurance for the afterlife. Priests and power, writing as control. Control over hieroglyphs meant control over meaning. For centuries, hieroglyphic literacy was confined to a small priestly elite. The ability to read and write sacred texts gave the temple class immense power. Even pharaohs relied on their scribes and priests to communicate with the gods. Temple walls became increasingly covered in dense layers of hieroglyphs. In the Ptolemaic period, after 300 BCE, inscriptions became so complex that even many priests couldn't fully decipher them. The language grew archaic and ceremonial, frozen in time, no longer matching spoken Egyptian. By that point, hieroglyphs had ceased to be a living script and had become more of a religious code, legible only to a dwindling few. But they still adorned temples, ensured the dead's passage into the next world, and reinforced the divine status of the ruler. Foreigners and misunderstandings. When Greek and Roman travelers encountered hieroglyphs, they were baffled. They saw them as picture puzzles, symbolic or mystical rather than phonetic. The idea that hieroglyphs could represent sounds, like an alphabet, was lost. Plutarch claimed hieroglyphs were a kind of visual philosophy. Later European scholars, drawing on Renaissance occultism, believed the signs encoded secret cosmic truths. They searched for hidden alchemical or esoteric meanings, completely missing their practical function. By the time of the Christianization of Egypt, under the Roman Empire, hieroglyphs were associated with paganism and suppressed. The last known hieroglyphic inscription, a short text in the Temple of Philae, was carved in 394 CE. After that, the knowledge was lost. A wall of silence. For over 1,400 years, hieroglyphs stood as mute witnesses. Tourists marveled at the beauty of the inscriptions but understood nothing. Temples became ruins. Papyrus scrolls crumbled. Egypt's ancient voices fell silent. It wasn't until Napoleon's campaign in Egypt 1798–1801 that serious scholarly interest returned. With the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, a trilingual decree in Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphs, a crack appeared in the wall. It would take years, and the genius of a young Frenchman named Jean-François Champollion, to reopen the script and awaken the silent stones. And so we ask, why did the Egyptians trust their eternal fate to a script so complex, so exclusive, and so deeply tied to stone? What did it mean to inscribe your name into the very bones of the earth? The Nile flows as it always has, slow, steady, ancient. Its rhythm shaped a civilization where permanence was everything. To the Egyptians, to be remembered was to live forever. And the way to be remembered, you wrote yourself into eternity. Hieroglyphs became the medium through which memory was carved, preserved, and consecrated. In this section, we follow the evolution of hieroglyphic writing through Egypt's long history, how it expanded, adapted, and increasingly became the language of the dead. We explore the rich texts of tombs and temples, the scribes' role in shaping spiritual understanding, and the shift from a living language to a secret priestly code. The expansion of the written word. During the Old Kingdom, c. 2686–2181 BCE, writing was largely the domain of kings and priests. Monumental inscriptions recorded royal deeds, religious dedications, and funerary texts. The pyramid texts, found in the tombs of kings at Saqqara, were the earliest examples of extensive religious literature intended solely for pharaohs. But as the Middle Kingdom emerged, c. 2055–1650 BCE, something changed. Death became democratized. Tombs of nobles and even well-off commoners began including inscriptions. The coffin texts, adapted from earlier pyramid spells, provided guidance for ordinary souls navigating the dangers of the Jewet, the Egyptian underworld. The texts were written on the inside surfaces of coffins, creating a protective chamber of sacred words. I shall not walk upside down. My head shall not be taken from me. My heart shall not be stolen. These spells and affirmations were often personalized, with the name of the deceased inserted. Hieroglyphs became keys to the afterlife, encoded contracts between the dead and the divine. The Book of the Dead. By the New Kingdom, c. 1550–1069 BCE, hieroglyphs reached their spiritual pinnacle with the rise of the Book of the Dead, Ru Nu Pert Mhru, the Book of Coming Forth by Day. This was not a single book, but a customizable collection of spells, typically written on papyrus scrolls and placed in tombs. The content varied depending on social class, wealth, and regional tradition. Common themes included spells to protect against demons, incantations to transform into animals or deities, instructions for passing the judgment of Osiris, maps of the underworld, hymns to Ra, the sun god. One of the most iconic scenes, the weighing of the heart, appears in many versions of the text. The heart of the deceased is weighed against the feather of Mad, goddess of truth and justice. If it balances, the soul proceeds to the afterlife. If not, it is devoured by the fearsome Ammit. This ritual was written, illustrated, and accompanied by prayers, all in hieroglyphs, a language frozen in time. While spoken Egyptian evolved over centuries, splitting into forms like Middle Egyptian, Late Egyptian, Demotic, and eventually Coptic, the hieroglyphic script remained rigid and archaic. By the Ptolemaic period, after 332 BCE, the difference between the spoken and written languages was vast. A temple scribe writing in hieroglyphs was essentially using a sacred dead language, comparable to medieval monks copying Latin texts they barely understood. This fossilization gave hieroglyphs a mystical aura. They were no longer tools for everyday expression, but ceremonial instruments of religious continuity. Each sign was weighted with centuries of tradition. The temples as scriptorial machines. Temples like Karnak, Luxor, Philae, and Edfu became factories of sacred text. Wall after wall, column after column, was covered in hieroglyphs. These inscriptions were not random, they were carefully organized, following strict canons of proportion and content. Texts praised gods, outlined rituals, recounted mythological origins, and inscribed cosmic order into stone. Each temple inscription served multiple purposes. Theological, preserving the beliefs of a local deity. Political, legitimizing the pharaoh's divine authority. Liturgical, ensuring that daily rituals were performed correctly, even if the priest forgot. At Edfu, for instance, the Temple of Horus contains over 100,000 hieroglyphic signs, forming a complete theological and ritual corpus. These were written not for casual readers, but for the gods themselves. Scribes as intermediaries. In this system, scribes held an extraordinary role. They weren't just writers, they were ritual specialists, linguists, and cosmic mediators. To write hieroglyphs correctly was to participate in divine order. An incorrectly carved sign could anger a deity or disrupt a ritual. Scribes worked in teams. One would draft the outlines in red ink. Another would ink the final version in black. A stone carver would chisel the shapes, and another might add color. It was a labor-intensive process, requiring precision and reverence. Some scribes added small annotations like colophons or dates or jokes. One marginal note from a new kingdom, Ostrakhan reads, "A scribe who knows not how to spell, he is a blind man holding a torch." Still, most scribes remained anonymous. Their mission was not self-expression but continuity. Foreign rule and script complexity. When foreign rulers arrived, Hyksos, Libyans, Nubians, Persians, Greeks, they often adopted Egyptian religious forms to legitimize their rule. They continued to build temples and sponsor hieroglyphic inscriptions. But as Egypt became increasingly multicultural, hieroglyphic texts grew more cryptic. In the Ptolemaic era, c. 305–30 BCE, inscriptions were intentionally complex, using rare signs, wordplay, and archaic grammar. This may have been a way for priests to assert their cultural identity in the face of Greek rule. The more obscure the text, the more sacred its meaning. This period produced beautiful but nearly indecipherable texts. Even the priests themselves likely needed glossaries to understand some of the passages they carved. The last hieroglyphs. Eventually, as Roman influence expanded and Christianity spread, Egypt's temples were closed. Pagan rituals were banned. Temple priests lost their authority. Without institutions to support it, hieroglyphic literacy collapsed. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE at the Temple of Philae. It is short and simple, barely a whisper. Ptah the scribe carved this in the name of the gods. And then nothing. For over 1,400 years, no one would write or read another hieroglyph. The meaning of the symbols passed into myth. Egyptian knowledge became the stuff of legend, its once practical writing system shrouded in mystery. The script becomes symbol. In the centuries that followed, hieroglyphs were admired for their beauty, not their meaning. They adorned European gardens, appeared in alchemical manuscripts, and were copied by Renaissance artists completely misunderstood. The word hieroglyph became synonymous with mystery itself. Yet within the lines and birds and reeds and eyes, the truth remained. The code was still there, waiting. And so we wonder, why did a civilization pour so much time, labor, and faith into a writing system so difficult to learn, so slow to inscribe, and so tightly guarded? Was it devotion or was it control? For over 1,000 years, the stones of Egypt stared silently at the world. Covered in delicate carvings of birds, suns, eyes, and serpents, they formed a script no one could read. Tourists wandered past temple walls, kings looted tombs, and priests of other faiths built churches atop ruins. The meaning of the hieroglyphs was lost until, at last, someone listened again. We follow the story of how hieroglyphs were deciphered, how a forgotten script was brought back to life by patient scholars, clever reasoning, and a moment of lucky preservation. We'll examine what hieroglyphs truly meant to the Egyptians and reflect on what it tells us about power, language, and how civilizations attempt to speak across the void of time. The mystery of the hieroglyphs. By the 5th century CE, few, if any, Egyptians still understood their ancient script. The rise of Christianity and later Islam brought new languages, new writing systems, and new ways of thinking about sacred texts. To outsiders, the carved symbols seemed mystical. Greek and Roman writers had already misunderstood them. Plutarch claimed that the hieroglyphs were symbols representing abstract ideas rather than words or sounds. This idea took root. During the Renaissance, European thinkers began to obsess over Egyptian script. They believed hieroglyphs held the secrets of alchemy, astrology, and divine truth. Countless books were written that speculated wildly without a shred of understanding. But none of these scholars could read a single glyph. For over 1,400 years, Egypt's own voice was silenced. The Rosetta Stone, an accidental key. Everything changed in 1799. During Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, a French officer near the town of Rosetta, modern-day Rashid, discovered a black basalt slab covered in writing. This was the Rosetta Stone, now housed in the British Museum. What made it remarkable was that it had the same text written in 3 scripts. Greek, Demotic, a late Egyptian script. Hieroglyphic. The Greek portion was readable. It stated that the stone was a decree issued in 196 BCE by Egyptian priests honoring Pharaoh Ptolemy V. It included the date, purpose, and content of the decree. At the time, scholars didn't know if the hieroglyphs were alphabetic, syllabic, or symbolic, but now, for the first time, they had a direct bilingual comparison. The race to decode. The decipherment effort was international. Scholars across Europe scrambled to unlock the stone's secrets. Among them were Thomas Young, England, a polymath who made early progress in recognizing that some hieroglyphs had phonetic values. He connected the demotic and hieroglyphic texts and correctly identified the cartouche as a name marker. Jean-François Champollion, France, a linguistic genius who built on Young's work and eventually cracked the code. Champollion's key insight came in the 1820s. By comparing the names of kings like Ptolemy and Cleopatra known from the Greek, he realized that hieroglyphs could represent sounds, not just symbols. He expanded his method, applying it to ancient Egyptian words and grammar. In 1822, he presented his findings in a letter to the Académie des Inscriptions et Belles Lettres in Paris. It was the birth certificate of Egyptology. Hieroglyphs reborn. Champollion's breakthrough meant that Egypt could now, finally, speak for itself. Over the next decades, scholars pored over temple inscriptions, tomb walls, papyri, and statuary. They discovered letters between scribes and officials, tax records, hymns to the gods, medical texts with diagnoses and remedies, legal contracts and court cases. One of the most striking revelations was the everyday nature of much of the writing. While the sacred texts were elaborate and spiritual, much of what was written down dealt with taxes, rations, land boundaries, and disputes over donkeys. The Egyptians had immortalized the mundane, just like the Mesopotamians had with their clay tablets. The layers of Egyptian writing. Through decipherment, scholars came to understand the multi-layered nature of Egyptian writing. Formal hieroglyphs, used in religious and ceremonial inscriptions, visually elaborate and artistically arranged. Hieratic script, cursive version of hieroglyphs used by priests and scribes for daily writing. Demotic, even more cursive and abstract, used for business and legal documents in the later periods. Coptic, the final stage of the Egyptian language, written in the Greek alphabet with additional letters. It is still used in the liturgy of the Coptic Church today. These layers tell a story of linguistic evolution, social change, and religious continuity, a civilization adapting its tools of expression across thousands of years. The voice of the scribe. In the hieroglyphs, we hear the voices of real people, not just kings and gods, but scribes who wrote with wit, sarcasm, frustration, and hope. One ostracon, a shard of pottery used for writing, contains a student's complaint. "My teacher has beaten me again. I did not deserve it. I wrote well. I wish I were a fisherman." Another tomb inscription reads, "I was a scribe of humble origins. I served in the temple of Amun. I copied the sacred texts with care. Let my name be remembered." In these small, humble lines, we feel the human desire to be seen, heard, remembered. Symbols of identity and power. Hieroglyphs were never just words, they were visual theology, a fusion of text and image. A scarab didn't just mean beetle, it meant rebirth. A feather didn't just mean truth, it was Mad herself. The Ankh wasn't just a symbol for life, it was life, divine and eternal. Every glyph carried layers of meaning, sound, concept, symbol, and the priests who used them wielded this knowledge carefully. Even today, the visual vocabulary of hieroglyphs remains powerful. The Ankh, the Eye of Horus, the scarab, they still appear in jewelry, tattoos, and pop culture. They remain cultural shorthand for mystery, eternity, and the ancient. What the resurrection taught us. The recovery of hieroglyphs changed history in several ways. It reconnected modern Egypt to its ancient past, giving Egyptians a clearer sense of their heritage. It created the field of Egyptology, a formal academic discipline with global influence. It challenged long-held assumptions that the ancients were primitive, superstitious, or unknowable. It showed the fragility of knowledge and how easily language, culture, and memory can vanish. But most of all, it reminded us that writing is power, the power to endure, to preserve, to speak across centuries. The legacy of the script. Today, no one writes in hieroglyphs. No legal contracts are carved into limestone, but the script's legacy remains. It teaches us how humans merge language and art, sound and symbol. It shows us the connection between writing and ritual, literacy and legitimacy. And it warns us, when the structures that support literacy collapse, so too does the knowledge. In the end, hieroglyphs were more than a writing system. They were Egypt's attempt to capture eternity, to make names, deeds, and beliefs imperishable. And while the script fell silent for centuries, it has spoken again. So now we ask, what modern scripts, symbols, or systems might one day fall silent only to be rediscovered by distant descendants? And what would they understand of us if all they had were the words we carved into stone? Open Book Story 3. Linear B and the Bureaucracy of Bronze Age Greece. The air is warm and dry as you walk through the ruins of Knossos. Sunlight filters over the remains of red pillars and dusty stone corridors. Once the largest palace on the island of Crete, this place was not only home to rulers and priests, it was a center of quiet, relentless administration. Though the grandeur of frescoes and myth of the Minotaur may dominate popular imagination, the real secret of Knossos lies not in its legends but in its records. Hidden beneath the debris of collapsed walls and storerooms were small, unassuming tablets, hundreds of them. They were inscribed in a script long forgotten, in a language no one could read. But together, they formed the earliest evidence of Greek writing, not in epic poems or heroic tales, but in inventory lists, agricultural logs, and bureaucratic memoranda. This is Linear B, the script of the Mycenaean Greeks, and it is the story of how writing served a civilization whose survival depended not on song or story, but on control. Before Linear B, the Minoan mystery. Before Linear B, there was Linear, an earlier, undeciphered script used by the Minoans, Crete's Bronze Age civilization. We still don't know what language it represents. Linear A appeared around 1800 BCE and was used primarily for administrative purposes. Its signs are linear and abstract, written left to right on clay tablets and ceilings. It likely recorded deliveries, taxes, and stockpiles, though, because we can't read it, we can't say for sure. Around 1450 BCE, something changed. The great Minoan palaces Knossos, Malia, Phaistos were destroyed or abandoned. In their place, a new power emerged, the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece. They took over Knossos, and with them came a new script, clearly influenced by Linear A but modified to suit a different language, Early Greek. The birth of Linear B. Linear B wasn't invented for poetry or history. Like its predecessors in Mesopotamia and Egypt, it emerged to serve a growing bureaucracy. Used between roughly 1450 and 1200 BCE, Linear B was written on clay tablets with a stylus probably made of wood or bone. The tablets were small, often palm-sized, and rectangular. They weren't fired intentionally. Instead, they were preserved by accident, baked in palace fires during violent destructions. Linear B consisted of syllabic signs, representing open syllables like pa, ki, row. Logograms, signs for entire words or concepts like sheep, man, wine. Numerical symbols, for counting commodities. The script could express only limited sounds and was not well suited for fluent writing of the Greek language. For instance, it had no sign for R, so Cretheus would be written as something like Kiri-tu. Vowels were often overrepresented, consonant clusters broken apart. Still, the script was efficient enough for its purpose, tracking resources. Scribes in the palace economy. The Mycenaean palaces at Knossos, Pylos, Thebes, and Mycenae weren't merely royal residences. They were command centers for redistributive economies. All goods, grain, oil, wool, livestock were collected by the palace, stored, processed, and redistributed to workers, temples, and elites. To manage this complex system, scribes recorded everything. These scribes were anonymous, and their work was mundane but vital. Tallies of oxen used in plowing. Records of bronze tools distributed to smiths. Listings of women and children assigned to textile work. Inventories of aromatic oils for religious ceremonies. At Pylos alone, over 1,200 tablets were found in a single archive room, suggesting a complex administrative machine. Each tablet was temporary. Once the year's data was obsolete, the clay could be recycled. But fire saved them, turning the ephemeral into the permanent. The invisible hands. We know surprisingly little about the scribes themselves. Most tablets don't mention authors or names, but through handwriting analysis, scholars have identified distinct scribal hands, essentially ancient penmanship profiles. In Pylos, over 30 different scribes have been detected. Each seems to have had a specialty: grain rations, textiles, religious offerings. They used standardized vocabulary and formulaic phrases. The writing was not literary, it was formulaic, utilitarian, and often full of abbreviations. In this way, the scribes of the Mycenaean world resemble those of Uruk or Memphis, the bureaucratic class, working behind the scenes, shaping civilization through paperwork. Names behind numbers. Despite the dry nature of the tablets, we catch fleeting glimpses of people. The names, recorded both of workers and officials, are unmistakably Greek. Eucles glorious, Achilles pain to the people, Nestor the one who returns from war. Some of these names appear later in Homer's epics, suggesting a thread of memory, though these records were never meant for storytelling. We also see the names of gods. Poseidon appears often, especially in contexts involving horses and earthquakes. Zeus, Hera, and Hermes show up in offerings. Potnia, a mysterious mistress, goddess, appears frequently, likely a holdover from Minoan religious tradition. Thus, even in this bureaucratic script, we glimpse a spiritual world, woven into the inventory lists. The administrative focus. The typical linear B tablet followed set formats. Heading, often the name of the official or district. Main entry, what commodity is being recorded. Quantities, numbers of items, animals, or people. Logograms, pictorial shorthand, e.g., a simplified sheep glyph meant sheep. Here is a simplified example. Terius, official, 80 sheep assigned to the shepherd Alcetas in the district of Pherae. Or 30 units of olive oil, perfumed with myrrh, for ritual use at the shrine of Potnia. Though not poetic, these lines reveal a structured society, deeply centralized and organized around a palace elite. Linear B's disappearance. Around 1200 BCE, something went wrong. The great Bronze Age palaces were destroyed, burned, looted, abandoned. This widespread collapse affected not just Greece but much of the eastern Mediterranean. Cities fell, trade routes vanished, writing systems including Linear B disappeared. With the fall of the palaces, the entire scribal tradition vanished. There was no transition into public literacy, no continuity of writing among the broader population. Greece entered a dark age, where writing was forgotten for nearly 400 years. When writing reappeared in the 8th century BCA, it came not from Linear B but from Phoenician influence, evolving into the Greek alphabet. Linear B, and the bureaucratic world it represented, was lost. Rediscovery in the modern era. The tablets were first discovered in the early 20th century by Arthur Evans, the British archaeologist who excavated Knossos. He named the scripts Linear A and Linear B based on their appearance. Evans assumed that Linear B was a Minoan script, not Greek, but he was wrong. It wasn't until the 1950s that an amateur linguist and architectural draftsman named Michael Ventris cracked the code. By analyzing sign frequencies and comparing them across sites, Ventris concluded that Linear B encoded an early form of Greek. His findings stunned the academic world. Greek had been written centuries earlier than anyone had imagined, but not for epic poetry, for taxes, sheep, and olive oil. And so the question is left hanging. Why did the Mycenaeans, so adept at organization, so skilled at administration, leave behind no trace of public literacy or literary culture? What did it mean that their first writing system lived and died entirely within the palace walls? The corridors of the Mycenaean palaces must have smelled of oil, wool, and clay. Their walls, now crumbled and silent, once echoed with footsteps of administrators, workers, guards, and, most critically, scribes. But they did not write songs. They did not record legends. They created logistics. We look deeper into the administrative core of the Mycenaean world, how Linear B operated in day-to-day governance, its limits and efficiencies, and how a fragile system of paperwork held an entire civilization together. This was not a culture built on imagination, but on ration lists, requisitions, and redistributions. If writing is a reflection of what a society values, then Linear B speaks volumes about the Mycenaean worldview. The structure of the Mycenaean state. The Mycenaean state wasn't like the sprawling empires of Mesopotamia or Egypt. Instead, it was a network of palace-centered territories. Each region, Mycenae, Pylos, Thebes, Turins, operated with its own central administration, headed by a king, Wanax. Beneath the king was a complex hierarchy. Lauishtas, military leader. Basilius, local chiefs. Cascaru, overseers. Demakaro, land managers. Scribes, record keepers. These officials administered goods, labor, and land. Everything revolved around the palace, which functioned as the hub of the redistributive economy. Linear B, then, wasn't a literary script, it was a state technology. It allowed the palace to monitor production, assess taxes in kind, assign labor, and allocate resources across vast and diverse territories. The redistributive economy. The key economic principle of the Mycenaean world was centralized redistribution. Let's walk through a typical cycle. Goods are collected. Farmers send grain, wine, olive oil, and livestock to the palace. Inventories are recorded. Scribes list amounts, producers, districts, and types of commodities. Resources are processed. Grain is milled, wool is spun, bronze is smelted. Products are distributed. Workers receive rations, priests receive offerings, elites get shipments. More records are made. Everything from a cup of oil to a herd of cattle is tracked in Linear B. This system depended on tight control and accurate data. If the scribes failed, the entire machine would break down. It also meant that writing was deeply tied to economic survival, not philosophical musing or cultural self-expression. The survival of the palace depended on paperwork. Labor, land, and levies. Linear B tablets tell us a great deal about labor organization. For example, in the textile industry, women were often employed as weavers, spinners, or assistants. Many were part of state-controlled groups called work groups, woroko. Some tablets record the rations given to dozens of such women, alongside their supervisors and dependent children. One tablet from Pylos lists 600 liters of grain to the women workers of the land of Kiri-Tu, with 200 to their children. Another lists quotas of wool and cloth expected to be produced by certain teams. Land assignments were also recorded. Land was allocated to elites, religious sanctuaries, and labor groups. Some land was temenos held by the gods and worked by temple dependents. Scribes noted every allocation, yield, and tax. The result was a society in which agriculture, religion, and administration were deeply entangled, all mediated through clay and stylus. A glimpse into the state religion. Linear B tablets give us tantalizing hints of religious practice, but always in administrative form. We don't have hymns or myths from this period. Instead, we have offerings, lists of goods delivered to sanctuaries or distributions for festivals. In Pylos, tablets record wine, honey, grain, and livestock set aside for the gods. Some tablets list deities by name. Poseidon is surprisingly prominent, more so than Zeus in some regions. Deuia, likely an early form of Zeus's feminine counterpart. Hermes appears in ritual contexts. Potnia, mistress, may refer to multiple local goddesses. Offerings are recorded meticulously. To Potnia, 1 amphora of honey. To Hermes, 1 sheep. To all the gods, 12 liters of wine. This tells us that religion, too, was budgeted, a logistical operation managed by the state. The scale of the bureaucracy. How much data did a palace process? At Pylos, archaeologists found over 1,200 tablets in the archives room. These tablets represented only 1 year's worth of administrative activity. The system used short-term records, with tablets designed to be temporarily dried but unfired and easily reusable. That they survived at all is an accident of history. The destruction of the palace by fire inadvertently fired the tablets, preserving them for archaeologists. Each tablet may record dozens of entries, meaning the scribes were processing thousands of transactions per year. The system was both complex and fragile. If the palace fell, the bureaucracy collapsed. Without the palace, there was no writing. This helps explain why Linear B disappeared so completely after the Bronze Age collapse. It wasn't a widespread literacy, it was an elite tool, confined to palace centers. Scribes, anonymous architects of order. Despite their central role, scribes are mostly invisible in the record. We know them only through handwriting. Archaeologists distinguish individual scribes by how they formed certain characters. Hand 1, Hand 2, Hand 21 at Pylos. These were people with years of training, memorizing sign lists and format templates. They worked with no ambition to be remembered. But their presence was essential. The records they created were the spine of the state. Without them, the palace could not manage trade, land, or labor. No temples could receive offerings. No warlord could requisition bronze. And when the palaces burned, their records became the final word of their world. Absence of narrative, presence of order. One of the most curious things about Linear B is what it doesn't contain. There are no myths, no epic poetry, no letters, no philosophical texts, no autobiographies. Compare this to Egypt, where hieroglyphs praised kings and guided the dead, or to Mesopotamia, where scribes wrote epics and omens. In the Mycenaean world, we have no stories. What we do have is a highly structured administrative corpus, a system designed to control, not to express. This suggests a literacy that was entirely utilitarian. The people of the Bronze Age Aegean may have had rich oral traditions, but they never committed them to clay. If Homer existed in their world, he left no written trace. Linear B's invisibility in later Greece. When writing returned to Greece in the 8th century BCE, It was completely different. The Greek alphabet, derived from Phoenician, was far more flexible and expressive. What's striking is that there is no reference in later Greek literature to Linear B or the bureaucracies that used it. Not in Homer, not in Herodotus, not in Plato. The knowledge of Linear B and its scribes had been completely forgotten. For centuries, the world believed Greek writing began with Homer. Only in the 20th century did the small, charred tablets of Pylos and Knossos rewrite that timeline. And even today, Linear B is largely a scholar's domain, dense, dry, and quietly revolutionary. And so the question remains, why did a literate, organized, and state-level society like the Mycenaeans fail to preserve their writing across generations? What does it mean when a culture's entire written legacy consists only of what it counted, taxed, and stored? Fire preserved the record, but not the memory. When the great palaces of the Mycenaean world went up in flames around 1200 BCE, thousands of clay tablets were accidentally fired into permanence. These thin, baked rectangles of administration became the last whispers of a world collapsing under the weight of its own complexities. We explore the fall of the Mycenaean writing system, how Linear B was entirely lost to time, and what its rediscovery means for our understanding of early Greek history. We'll also consider what the limitations of Linear B can teach us about literacy, control, and the fragility of recorded knowledge in the face of systemic collapse. The Bronze Age collapse. Around 1200 BCE, something swept across the eastern Mediterranean like a slow-moving firestorm. Entire cities were sacked, trade routes vanished, kingdoms fell. Historians refer to it as the Late Bronze Age collapse, a cascading failure of interconnected states and systems. Among the casualties, the Hittite Empire vanished. The cities of the Levant were burned. Egyptian records speak of invasion by the enigmatic Sea Peoples. And in mainland Greece, the Mycenaean palaces were destroyed, abandoned, and never rebuilt. No one knows precisely why. Was it war, drought, earthquakes, internal unrest? Likely it was a combination, but the result was clear. The administrative core of Mycenaean society disintegrated. With the palaces gone, the bureaucracies vanished, and with them the scribes. The end of writing. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, Mycenaean Greece had no independent scribal class outside the palace structure. Writing had never become part of everyday life. It was a centralized tool, confined to the uppermost layers of society. There were no letters written between distant lovers, no poems penned by aristocrats, no graffiti scratched into walls. So when the scribes disappeared, there was no one left to remember how to write. Linear B was forgotten, not gradually but immediately and completely. There is no evidence of the script's survival into the subsequent Greek Dark Age, c. 1100–800 BCE, not even as folklore. No one wrote again in Greek for nearly 400 years. The oral gap. And yet Greece did not become mute. The people remembered but not in writing. Instead, the Mycenaeans and their descendants preserved culture through oral tradition. Bards and storytellers carried tales of gods, heroes, wars, and homecomings. These stories, transmitted and reshaped over generations, would one day become the Iliad and the Odyssey. When the Greek alphabet emerged around 800 BCE, inspired by Phoenician traders, it was quickly put to use to capture these oral traditions. Ironically, then, Greek literature began with the recording of memory, not the administration of goods. In contrast to Linear B, which never wrote a line of poetry, the alphabet was almost immediately used for art. This divide marks a key shift, from pragmatic writing to expressive writing, from counting sheep to remembering Achilles. Linear B's silent survival. Linear B might have remained unknown forever, except for a few quirks of fate. Archaeologists began discovering clay tablets at sites like Knossos and Pylos in the early 20th century. They noted their strange, linear symbols and puzzled over their purpose. But it wasn't until Michael Ventris, an English architect with a fascination for codes, cracked the script in the 1950s that the mystery was solved. Ventris showed that the language beneath Linear B wasn't Minoan or Semitic, it was an early form of Greek. This revelation changed everything. It pushed back the history of Greek writing by centuries and revealed a bureaucratic prehistory to a culture previously known only for its poetry, philosophy, and sculpture. The Greeks had not begun with Homer, they had begun with inventories. A world built on clay. Today, Linear B remains a niche specialty, a script used only by scholars. But the tablets continue to reveal details of a world long gone. Trade and economy, evidence of exchange between palace centers, taxation in kind, and a system of resource allocation that was advanced for its time. Religion, mentions of gods familiar and unfamiliar, offerings and priestly titles. Names and places, early attestations of toponyms and personal names, many of which survive into classical Greek. Social structure, insights into class divisions, labor hierarchies, and the gendered nature of work. The cumulative effect is a portrait of a civilization that was highly organized, deeply stratified, and critically dependent on centralized control. And its writing system reflected those priorities focused on managing materials, labor, and status. The fragility of writing systems. The story of Linear B is a reminder that writing, though powerful, is not inevitable. It depends on institutions that value and preserve it, training to pass it on, mediums that survive, purposes that evolve. Linear B was powerful but narrow. It never expanded beyond its bureaucratic use. When its support structures collapsed, the script had no life outside of ledgers and archives. By contrast, the later Greek alphabet, simpler, more flexible, and eventually widespread, allowed for personal, poetic, and political expression. It wasn't just a tool for rulers. It became a tool for citizens. The echoes of the scribes. What became of the scribes when the palaces fell? Did they die in the fires? Flee to the hills? Did they attempt to preserve their tablets, knowing they would not be read? We don't know. They left no epitaphs. Their hands are remembered only in the curvature of stylus strokes. Their names, if ever written, are lost, but their work remains. Each tablet is a testament to their precision, their discipline, and their obscurity. They lived lives defined by repetition and regulation, and yet they have endured longer than any of the heroes they never wrote about. The value of the boring. In the end, Linear B gives us a paradox. It is a script that recorded no literature, yet wrote the foundations of a civilization. It did not chronicle battles, but assigned rations to the warriors. It did not compose hymns, but calculated the oil for the priesthood. It did not write histories, but it was history baked into clay. And though it left no myths, its survival tells a quiet story of human organization, of the effort to bring order to complexity, and of how a civilization once believed that everything important could be written down. So we end with this question. What parts of our modern world are files, spreadsheets, forms will survive us? Will the future see meaning in our ledgers the way we now find wonder in the clay of Pylos? Story 4. The Oracle Bones of Shang, China. You are standing in a quiet field near the banks of the Yellow River. The ground is hard-packed earth. The wind carries dust across the plains. Somewhere beneath your feet, buried for over 3,000 years, lie fragments of bone and turtle shell, scratched, scorched, and cracked. These are not debris. They are messages, not to the living but to the divine. This is Anyang, the last capital of the Shang dynasty, c. 1600–1046 BCE. It is here, among the tombs and ruined palaces, that the first known Chinese writing system was born not as a tool of commerce or poetry, but of prophecy. These are the oracle bones, and they mark one of history's quietest revolutions, the transformation of cracked shells and ancestral questions into a fully formed script, one that would, remarkably, evolve directly into modern Chinese. Bone, shells, and questions to the ancestors. Oracle bones were used by the Shang kings for a very specific and sacred purpose: divination. The process was ritualized and exact. First, a turtle plastron underside or a shoulder blade from an ox was prepared. These bones were polished and smoothed. Small pits were carved on one side. Then a diviner would pose a question, often on behalf of the king. The topics varied. Should we go to war? Will the harvest be good? Is this day auspicious for a sacrifice? Has the ancestor accepted our offering? The bone was heated with a metal rod until it cracked. The diviner interpreted the pattern of the cracks as the answer yes, no, or ambiguous. Then and only then, the question, answer, and sometimes the result were inscribed directly onto the bone in early Chinese characters. The birth of a script. The inscriptions were brief, sometimes just a few characters, but they were astonishing in their sophistication. This wasn't proto-writing. It was fully developed logographic writing. Each character represented a word or morpheme. Characters were already composed of components, with phonetic and semantic parts. Many characters from oracle bones are recognizable in modern Chinese, albeit in evolved forms. This means that Chinese writing did not emerge gradually over centuries. It appeared suddenly, fully functional, and in use by a centralized elite. That sudden appearance suggests a lost prehistory writing systems or stages that may have existed but were never preserved. Unlike Mesopotamia's cuneiform or Egypt's hieroglyphs, which evolved visibly over time, the Chinese script enters the historical record already mature. Who did the writing? The Shang king was not just a ruler, he was the chief diviner, the mediator between the living and the spirits. But he did not write the characters himself. That job fell to a class of scribes and ritual specialists, trained to handle the delicate work of bone carving and character inscription. These scribes had to carve the question clearly and concisely, record the date and the name of the diviner, possibly annotate the answer and result, preserve the bone for future consultation. Some bones show multiple inscriptions. Others are large, with dozens of divinations covering an entire surface. The characters were incised with sharp tools, requiring both skill and patience. It was precise, deliberate work, writing not meant for the public, but for posterity and the divine. What the bones tell us. Tens of thousands of oracle bones have been uncovered, mostly from Xi'an, the site of the ancient Shang capital. The questions inscribed provide a detailed, if one-sided, view of Shang society. War and diplomacy. The king frequently asked about military campaigns, border security, and the intentions of rivals. Weather and agriculture. Will it rain? Will there be a drought? Is this season good for planting millet? Sacrifice and ritual. What offerings should be made to which ancestor? Has the spirit received them? Royal births and illness. Will the queen give birth safely? Will the king recover from his fever? Some questions are startlingly personal. Should we sacrifice a dog to grandfather Yi to ensure the king's toothache subsides? Others are eerily specific. In the next 10 days, will there be disaster from the east? In these records, we hear the anxieties of a kingdom, not abstract philosophy, but daily concerns about survival, legitimacy, and favor from the ancestors. The religious core of writing. Writing in Shang China was not a tool of commerce. It was not a literary pursuit. It was a sacred act. This early Chinese writing served ancestral worship, Communication with spirits was central to Shang belief. Ritual correctness. The wrong offering made on the wrong day could bring disaster. State authority. Only the king and his court could access the divine through writing. In this system, writing was power. To write was to participate in cosmic order, to influence fate, to record outcomes in a way that could be referenced, judged, and remembered. The script had no public purpose. It was a closed system, maintained by elites, shaped by ritual and passed down through tightly controlled channels. A script that endured. What's most remarkable about Oracle Bone script is that it was not a dead end. While cuneiform and hieroglyphs faded or were replaced, Chinese script survived. Over centuries, it changed form. From carved bones to brush on bamboo slips. From formal characters to cursive scripts. From oracle bones to imperial calligraphy. But the structure remained. Logographic foundations. Semantic and phonetic elements. Visual emphasis on balance and structure. Many characters used today like Chinese letter sun, Chinese letter moon, Chinese letter king, Chinese letter horse are direct descendants of oracle bone forms. This makes Chinese the oldest continuously used writing system in the world. The rediscovery. For over 3,000 years, the oracle bones lay forgotten. But in the late 19th century, scholars in Beijing began to notice strange symbols carved on dragon bones, animal bones sold by apothecaries, and ground into powder for medicine. Upon closer inspection, these were not magical artifacts but ancient writing. Soon after, archaeologists traced the bones to their source Enyang and began a scientific excavation. What they found was a complete archive of Shang ritual, buried in pits, broken and discarded, but preserved nonetheless. The study of these bones gave birth to a new academic field, oracle bone studies, Jiaguksu. And so we are left with a mystery. Why did this rich, sacred, and structured writing system begin not with literature or law, but with fire and bone? What does it mean that China's written history was born in the pursuit of divine answers to earthly fears? The world of the Shang was shaped not by kings alone, but by ghosts. Beneath the formal structure of court and army lay a deeper logic, a society governed by the favor or displeasure of the dead. And it was through the oracle bones that this world maintained its connection to the invisible realm. We will examine how the divination system functioned as both religious communication and state apparatus. We'll explore the institutionalization of writing, how scribes preserved the king's inquiries, and how every crack and carved character helped forge early Chinese civilization. The process was not just mystical, it was political, administrative, and profoundly psychological. Divination as a system. The Shang king did not act on impulse. Decisions military, agricultural, spiritual were filtered through a ritual process that was structured and repeatable. This was divination by heat-induced cracks, a practice that turned uncertainty into consensus. The sequence usually went as follows. Selection of the medium. Plastron's turtle undersides were preferred for high-status queries, scapulae, shoulder blades for more mundane ones. Preparation. Grooves were carved into the surface. Questions were phrased formulaically. Heating. A hot rod was applied to create a crack. Some bones were inscribed before cracking, others after. Interpretation. The diviner, often the king himself or a trusted official, read the pattern of cracks. Inscription. The full process query, outcome, and sometimes result was carved in early Chinese characters. Some bones show multiple questions per session. Others record follow-ups or contradictory queries. Many reflect anxiety, repetition, or urgent concern. For example, will it rain tomorrow? Will it rain tomorrow if we make a cow sacrifice today? Will it rain if we sacrifice a cow and a sheep together? The bones show a civilization trying to control chaos with ritual to impose order not through force, but through questions. The state, the dead, and the written record. Divination was not optional, it was an arm of government. Shang kings used oracle bones to legitimize authority. Consulting the ancestors affirmed the king's divine mandate. Enforce ritual conformity. Every ceremony, sacrifice, or public event was divinely timed. Maintain records. Unlike oral memory, the bones preserved decisions and outcomes in a durable medium. This created a feedback loop. The king asked the ancestors. The ancestors gave answers through cracks. The answers were recorded. The records justified action. Actions created new outcomes, which were then questioned again. This recursive, circular model of governance is unique. The oracle bones became official documents, yet were not publicly displayed. They were buried in pits once they had served their purpose, used, then discarded, like exhausted tools of the state. The role of scribes. The act of carving early Chinese characters into bone required specialized skill. Scribes operated in a hierarchical environment, with some focused on cutting characters, others handling interpretation, and some possibly responsible for archiving. Over time, specialists emerged. Crackers, heat applicators who performed the physical divination. Readers, those who interpreted the cracks. Writer, scribes who incised the text. Interestingly, some oracle bones are grouped by handwriting style, suggesting individual scribes had unique carving techniques. This has allowed modern scholars to identify specific scribes, known only by their characteristic forms. These scribes were not creative writers. Their job was to maintain a strict format. A typical inscription might read, "On day Bingsu we cracked the shell. The king asked, 'Should we sacrifice to ancestor Yi?' The crack was auspicious. We did sacrifice." The language is formulaic. The character set is small but precise. And yet, across thousands of bones, a civilization's logic unfolds. Ancestral worship, a social framework. The Shang didn't just honor their ancestors, they governed through them. Each royal ancestor was believed to retain consciousness and power after death. Their favor could bring rain, victory, fertility, or protection. Their anger could bring drought, rebellion, or plague. To manage this, the Shang established sacrificial calendars. Certain days were designated for specific ancestors. Offerings, from grain and wine to dogs, cattle, or even humans. Names and genealogies, carefully maintained through ritual inscriptions. Oracle bones recorded these relationships with bureaucratic regularity. In one bone, we read, "Has the king's grandfather accepted the black ox?" This is followed by a record of outcome, perhaps yes, auspicious, or no crack, ambiguous. Thus, writing became a ledger of the invisible, a record of conversations between the living and the dead. Topics of inquiry. Although ritual dominated, a wide range of secular concerns also appeared in the inscriptions. Weather, will there be a storm during the harvest? Agriculture, is this a good day to plant millet? War, should we attack the tribe next week? Health, will the queen recover from her illness? Births, will the royal consort give birth to a boy? Some inquiries are strikingly personal, even vulnerable. Will the king's toothache end if we offer a pig to ancestor Zhai? Others are ominous. Will there be enemy movement near the river in the next 3 days? This range of queries reflects a world in which every uncertainty demanded divine consultation, and every consultation left a physical, written trace. Managing time and memory. The Shang also used oracle bones to track time. Each inscription is dated using the sexagenary cycle, a traditional Chinese calendar system based on combinations of 10 heavenly stems and 12 earthly branches, producing a repeating 60-day cycle. This allowed scribes to precisely date every divination, track frequency of events, correlate sacrifices and outcomes. The use of dating also implies a historical consciousness, a desire to archive decisions, not just make them. Oracle bones weren't ephemeral, they were reference documents, stored for future consultation. Yet despite this, many bones were ultimately discarded, buried in large pits at ritual sites, sometimes broken, sometimes intact. Perhaps they were seen as spiritually used, no longer charged with divine potential. Scale and organization. Tens of thousands of bones have been recovered, but these represent only a fraction of what once existed. At Anyang alone, over 100,000 fragments have been cataloged. Most were discovered in structured pits, suggesting deliberate deposition. Some were organized by topic or date. Many came from a single period, the reign of King Wu Ding, c. 1250–1192 BCE, whose rule saw a vast expansion of written divination. This indicates that the Shang kept extensive ritual archives, even if they weren't maintained as libraries in the modern sense. Each bone was a node in a network, a single data point in a vast, decentralized system of spiritual governance. Early Chinese literacy as elite technology. Much like linear B or cuneiform, early Chinese writing was restricted to the elite, used for specific functions, tied to religious and administrative roles. It was not used for poetry, essays, or entertainment. No songs, no proverbs, no myths. Yet unlike linear B, which vanished with its palaces, Chinese script continued. Why? Because writing eventually expanded its utility. Over time, it moved from bone to bamboo, from temple to court, from oracle to scholar. But at its root, the script's authority came from its origin in ritual. To write was to interface with power divine, royal, ancestral. And so we're left to ask, how did a writing system born from heat and bone evolve into one of the world's most enduring literary traditions? And how did its sacred beginnings shape the character of Chinese thought and record-keeping for millennia to come? The fire has cooled, and the cracks have long since faded. But the words remain scratched into the bones of cattle and turtles, preserved in dry soil, forgotten and rediscovered. The questions asked by Shang kings have long since passed into silence, but the act of asking through heat, ritual, and writing left behind the seeds of a literary tradition that would stretch for more than 3,000 years. We explore the long legacy of the oracle bone script. We consider how its role shifted from divination to record-keeping, how it survived in form if not in function, and what it reveals about early Chinese values. Through the medium of brittle bones and polished shells, the Shang gave birth not just to a way of writing, but to a way of thinking about the world. The transition from divination to administration. Though the oracle bones were primarily ritual objects, they also functioned as records meticulously organized, dated, and categorized. This blurring of spiritual inquiry and administrative documentation laid the groundwork for China's long tradition of bureaucratic literacy. By the end of the Shang dynasty, writing was already standardized enough for replication across generations. Linked to political authority, especially the king's divine mandate. Valued as permanent, something carved and saved, not merely spoken and forgotten. With the fall of the Shang around 1046 BCE and the rise of the Zhou dynasty, the focus of writing shifted. Oracle bone divination faded. Bronze inscriptions became the dominant medium. Writing moved slowly toward secular uses, genealogies, treaties, and edicts. But the script itself survived. Evolving through early forms of bronze and bamboo writing, it retained its logographic nature. That continuity is remarkable. A character like Chinese letter, mountain, looks almost the same in an oracle bone from 1200 BCE and in modern printed Chinese. Forgotten bones, remembered words. For over 2,000 years after the Shang, oracle bones were not mentioned in official histories. The practice of bone divination had become obsolete and perhaps deliberately suppressed, seen as archaic or heterodox by later Confucian scholars. It wasn't until the late Qing dynasty, in the late 1800s, that the bones were rediscovered by accident. Merchants in Henan province had been selling dragon bones to apothecaries for use in traditional medicine. These bones were ground into powder and believed to treat ailments. One day, a scholar named Wang Yang, suffering from malaria, noticed tiny carvings on the pieces his doctor had prescribed. Realizing they might be ancient script, he began collecting more. Within years, oracle bone inscriptions became the subject of intense academic study. What had been forgotten for millennia was now a living field. Jiaguksu, the study of oracle bones. Reconstructing a civilization from fragments. Archaeologists descended on Anyang identified as the site of the Shang capital, Yin, in the early 20th century. They uncovered foundations of palaces and temples, royal tombs filled with bronzes and jades, burial pits with chariots and sacrificed animals, and most significantly, oracle bone archives. From these shards, researchers began to reconstruct the Shang world. Lineages of kings, geographic boundaries of the Shang domain, religious beliefs centered on ancestral power, the importance of ritual cycles, seasonal sacrifice, and cosmic order. Each bone, no longer dismissed as medicine or debris, became a document, an official, dated, and inscribed testimony of a royal inquiry. And because they were not meant to be read publicly, they are honest in their mundane fears. They show a ruling class anxious about the weather, childbirth, rebellion, or a headache. In their repetition, we find a deeply human rhythm, a civilization trying, again and again, to know what cannot be known. A world built on inquiry. At its core, the oracle bone tradition was an act of systematic questioning. What will happen? What should we do? Have we pleased the ancestors? What will go wrong if we act? It was never neutral. The bones were tools of decision-making in a tightly controlled society, and through writing, those decisions gained permanence. The bones also reveal a desire to track outcomes to verify whether a prediction came true. This speaks to a kind of proto-empiricism, a habit of correlating action and result. The Shang didn't merely ask the gods, they measured what followed. In this way, oracle bones represent an early, tentative bridge between ritual logic and record-based, reasoning the seeds of what would become China's long administrative state. Continuity through chain. What is most remarkable is how the writing system of the Shang survived even as its functions shifted. From divination to documentation, from shell to bamboo slip, from private ritual to public edict, from spiritual inquiry to political order. Through the Zhou, Qin, Han, and all later dynasties, the Chinese script retained its logographic structure, a direct inheritance from the bones. Even today, children in Beijing or Taipei learn to write characters whose ancestry can be traced back to those turtle shells in Anyang. That continuity is unmatched anywhere in the world. The lingering spirit of the bones. Though the practice of bone divination ended, the worldview it embodied lingered in Chinese thought. A belief in the agency of ancestors. A sense that time flows in cyclical rhythms, to be aligned with. The conviction that correct ritual ensures cosmic harmony. And the value of writing as preservation, not invention. This outlook shaped Confucianism, imperial bureaucracy, Chinese historiography, and even traditional medicine. The idea that writing could shape fate, that what was recorded became real, never quite disappeared. Oracle bones today. In modern China, oracle bones are no longer mystical. They are cultural treasures held in museums and archives, studied by paleographers, linguists, and historians. Yet they still inspire awe. Each bone is a direct line to a Bronze Age king, a record of a single day preserved across millennia, a piece of the longest continuous writing system in human history. They are often displayed under glass, softly lit, with magnifying lenses for close inspection. Visitors lean in, tracing the shallow lines carved 3,000 years ago, trying to read the thoughts of people who died before the Iliad was ever sung. And the bones, though silent, speak again. The boring power of bone. The oracle bones are not dramatic. They are small, quiet, repetitive. They don't tell stories in the usual sense. But they tell a civilization. They tell us what kings feared. They tell us how writing emerged not for art, but for ritual control. They show that a society could build its institutions on questions, not answers. In the end, they remind us that the beginnings of writing, whether in Uruk, Thebes, Pylos, or Enyang, were not poetic or noble. They were administrative, sacred, and often dull. But in their dullness, they endured. So we close with this thought. If your questions were etched in bone and buried for 3,000 years, what would they say about your world? Would they reveal the truth of your fears, or only the outline of the systems you trusted to make sense of them? Story 5. The Scribes of Ugarit, Inventing the Alphabet. You sit beside the Mediterranean coast, where the evening breeze carries the scent of salt and cedar. The city of Ugarit lies behind you, a modest but bustling port nestled at the edge of the Levant, just north of modern-day Syria. It is the late 14th century BCE, and the sun is setting over the ruins of what will someday be one of the least remembered, yet most influential cities in human history. For it is here, amid the palace courtyards and scribal schools of Ugarit, that something radical was born, not a new empire or a great army, but a new way to write. Here, the ancient scribes took the clumsy, sacred complexity of cuneiform and created something smaller, faster, and shockingly efficient: the first known alphabet. A city of two worlds. Ugarit was not large, it was not powerful, but it was connected. Located at the crossroads between Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant, Ugarit was a multilingual city-state, home to merchants, officials, and scribes who had to navigate multiple cultures and writing systems. Tablets unearthed from Ugarit's palace archives show Akkadian documents for diplomacy, written in cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs on imported artifacts, Hurrian and Hittite records from Anatolia, and most surprisingly, a totally unique writing system carved into clay, not borrowed, but invented. This invention would later influence Phoenician, Greek, Latin, Arabic, and beyond. But its origin lies here, in a relatively quiet city among scribes with too much to memorize. The weight of cuneiform. By the time Ugarit flourished, the cuneiform system of writing had existed for over a millennium. Originating in Sumer and spreading through Akkad, Assyria, and Babylon, cuneiform was written with wedge-shaped impressions in clay, based on hundreds of signs, mixed logograms, whole words, syllabic signs, and determinatives. Complex to learn, and even more complex to use properly. A skilled Mesopotamian scribe needed to memorize over 600 signs, understand nuances of grammar, and apply regional variations. This made writing a profession, not a general skill. It was sacred, state-controlled, and slow. The scribes of Ugarit learned this system because they had to. But somewhere around 1400 BCE, they did something astonishing. They simplified it. A new script emerges. In a scribal school just outside the palace, archaeologists uncovered tablets unlike any others in the region. These tablets were written in cuneiform style, wedge-shaped impressions, but contained only about 30 unique signs. representing sounds, not ideas or syllables. This was the Ugaritic alphabet, the first known example of a true alphabetic script. Each sign represented a consonant sound. The system was abjadic vowels were left unwritten, as in later Semitic scripts. It was used for writing the Ugaritic language, a Semitic tongue closely related to Hebrew and Phoenician. In a world where writing meant learning 500+ signs, the Ugaritic scribes had reduced their system to about 30. It was a revelation. Not drawn but carved. Interestingly, the Ugaritic script retained the look of cuneiform. The characters were still composed of wedge-shaped impressions made with a stylus on soft clay. But these signs were entirely new creations, not borrowed from the standard Akkadian set. For example, the letter might be represented by a two-wedge configuration. K by three wedges pointing down. M by a distinct cluster angled to the left. There was no visual logic from Sumer or Babylon. The scribes were repurposing the tool, the stylus and clay, but not the system. They had learned from Mesopotamia, but they did not copy it, they transformed it. Why invent an alphabet? The answer may lie in practical necessity. Ugarit was a cosmopolitan city with traders speaking many languages, local bureaucrats who needed to record taxes, treaties, and inventories, scribes who had to process complex information rapidly. For local, internal use, the massive bulk of cuneiform was simply too cumbersome. An alphabet required fewer signs to memorize, was easier to teach, allowed for phonetic spelling, accommodating new words and names, and could be written faster on clay. The Ugaritic script was never meant to replace Akkadian cuneiform on the international stage, but for local communication, it offered speed and simplicity. What was written? Among the hundreds of Ugaritic tablets found, some key uses of the new script include royal letters to local governors, inventories of trade goods and palace supplies, religious texts including hymns, myths, and rituals, legal contracts, property transfers, and marriage agreements, linguistic exercises from scribal schools like abecedaries, ABC listings. One tablet contains a mythological poem about Baal, the storm god. Another outlines ritual offerings for seasonal festivals. Yet another is just a practice tablet, repeating the alphabet over and over, a glimpse into how the script was taught. This was not just a code, it was a living script, used for both sacred and practical purposes. Who were the Ugaritic scribes? The scribes of Ugarit operated in a small but sophisticated network of schools attached to the palace. They were trained in multiple scripts, Akkadian cuneiform, Ugaritic, possibly hieroglyphs, diplomatic etiquette to handle foreign correspondence, religious rituals, since many texts were liturgical, and importantly, linguistic innovation. These scribes were not merely passive copyists. They were creative problem solvers, figuring out how to adapt writing to their city's unique needs. Some scholars suggest that Ugaritic scribes were the first to conceptualize writing as a phonetic system, a way to record how words sound, not just what they mean. This idea would reverberate through history, from the Phoenician traders who later simplified the alphabet further, to the Greeks who added vowels, and eventually to the Latin script used today. The Quiet Revolution. The invention of the Ugaritic alphabet did not spark an immediate literacy explosion. In fact, the script was used only for about 200 years. By 1190 BCE, Ugarit was destroyed, part of the wider collapse of Bronze Age civilizations in the eastern Mediterranean. The script fell out of use. The city was buried and forgotten. And yet, the idea of the alphabet lived on, refined by the Phoenicians, who spread it across the Mediterranean. The Ugaritic scribes had unknowingly planted a seed that would grow into the most widely used writing system in the world. So we pause with a question. What drives a person, not a king or prophet, but a working scribe, to invent an entirely new way to write? Was it frustration, fatigue, ambition, or the quiet desire to make the tools of knowledge just a little easier to hold? The wind blows softly through the ruins of Ugarit. The baked mud walls, broken columns, and shattered clay tablets lie half buried in the Levantan earth. Once, these walls heard the chanting of scribes, the clatter of styluses against wet clay, and the murmur of merchants trading barley for copper, cedar for linen. Now it is quiet, but somewhere in that silence is a trace of what the Ugaritic scribes left behind, not just in clay, but in the architecture of modern writing. This section traces how the Ugaritic script spread or didn't after its creation, and how its quiet innovation reshaped the world even after the city that birthed it vanished in flame and dust. An alphabet abandoned. Despite its elegance and efficiency, the Ugaritic alphabet did not spread beyond Ugarit in its original form. It remained local, used mainly for palace administration and religious texts. Several factors explain this limited use. Geopolitical fragility. Ugarit was a small, vulnerable city-state. It relied heavily on alliances with larger powers like Egypt and the Hittite Empire. Short lifespan. The script was in use for only about 200 years before the city was destroyed. Material limitations. Ugaritic was a clay-based script written with a wedge-shaped stylus. It required soft tablets and careful drying or baking. Existing power structures. Akkadian cuneiform remained the lingua franca of diplomacy. Egyptian hieroglyphs dominated to the south. The alphabet didn't fit into those entrenched systems easily. So despite being functionally superior, simpler, faster, more phonetic, the Ugaritic alphabet was buried with the city that created it. But ideas, like seeds, do not always die with their source. A neighbor named Byblos. To the south of Ugarit lay Byblos, a Phoenician port city famous for exporting cedar wood and papyrus. Unlike Ugarit, Byblos survived the late Bronze Age collapse and entered the Iron Age with a firm grip on Mediterranean trade. Here, sometime around 1050 BCE, we find a new script, one that resembles Ugaritic in spirit, but not in shape. This is the Phoenician alphabet. It had 22 consonant letters. It was linear, not wedge-shaped. It could be written on papyrus or parchment, not just clay. And it was portable, adaptable across cultures and materials. While no direct evidence links Ugaritic script to Phoenician, the geographic and chronological proximity is hard to ignore. Both were Semitic languages. Both sought to simplify older writing systems. Both broke writing down to individual sounds rather than ideas. Ugaritic's innovation may not have traveled in the form of letters, but its principle did. From Phoenicia to the world. The Phoenician alphabet spread like wildfire, not because it was beautiful, but because it was useful. As Phoenician traders established colonies from Carthage to Cyprus, they brought their script with them. Other cultures took note. The Greeks adapted it and added vowels. The Etruscans borrowed it from the Greeks. The Romans inherited it, forming the basis of the Latin alphabet. Later, the Arabic and Hebrew scripts also evolved from early Semitic roots, themselves likely influenced by the same trends that shaped Ugaritic. Today, when you type or write in English, Spanish, Hindi, or Swahili, you're using a descendant of that Phoenician family tree, a tree with roots that may well begin in Ugarit. The silent collapse. Around 1190 BCE, Ugarit was destroyed. The cause remains unclear. Some point to the enigmatic sea peoples, seaborne raiders who swept through the eastern Mediterranean. Others suggest internal unrest, drought, or overextension of fragile alliances. What we know is this: the palace was burned. The archives were buried. The alphabet ceased to be used. Unlike Egypt or Assyria, Ugarit left no literary tradition behind. There are no Ugaritic scrolls, no inscriptions in stone temples, no vast empire of copies. Its clay tablets, ironically, were preserved precisely because they were fired in the blaze that destroyed the city. Had Ugarit survived, its tablets might have been reused, erased, or lost to time. Instead, they were baked into permanence by catastrophe, rediscovery, and decipherment. For over 3,000 years, Ugarit was forgotten. It wasn't until 1928, when a Syrian farmer near Ras Shamra accidentally uncovered a tomb, that the city re-entered human memory. Excavations revealed a royal palace, temples to Baal and Dagon, storage rooms filled with tablets, and two distinct scripts, Akkadian cuneiform and the unknown Ugaritic alphabet. At first, scholars mistook the Ugaritic tablets for a variant of Mesopotamian cuneiform. But soon, they realized this was something different, an alphabetic system using cuneiform shapes. Decipherment began quickly, aided by bilingual tablets, Ugaritic and Akkadian. Familiar mythological names, like Baal and El. Abecedaries, tablets listing the letters in order. By the 1930s, the script had been cracked. A city that had vanished before Homer sang had now spoken again. What the tablets say. The Ugaritic texts reveal a world of mythology and ritual, texts honoring Baal, El, and Asherah, the gods of Canaan. Legal transactions, sales of land, slaves, animals, and provisions. Instruction, lists of words, signs, and grammatical notes used in teaching scribes. Royal correspondence, letters between kings, often formal and deferential. One poem, known as the Baal Cycle, is a theological epic that predates and parallels many biblical themes: conflicts among gods, creation through struggle, divine kingship, and death's impermanence. Another tablet simply lists the alphabet over and over again, evidence of how this revolutionary system was taught, memorized, and drilled. In their ordinariness, these texts show us that the alphabet was not a magic wand. It was a tool born from the need to manage a complex society. But in simplifying writing, it enabled complexity to grow elsewhere in commerce, storytelling, and eventually, mass literacy. The shape of writing to come. What the Ugaritic scribes invented was not a language or a myth or a law. It was a structure, a system of representing spoken sounds through a minimal set of symbols. They likely did not know what they had achieved. For them, it was a practical adjustment, a better way to write clay-based Semitic words. But the alphabet they created, shaped like cuneiform, but functioning like the ABCs, set a precedent. After Ugarit, writing no longer needed to be sacred. It no longer belonged only to temples, kings, or gods. It could be taught, used, adapted, and eventually spread by traders, teachers, and travelers. And so we are left with an unanswered question. How many other cities invented scripts that were never preserved, never baked in fire, never rediscovered? Is it chance alone that allows one alphabet to survive while others vanish? And how might our own systems of writing evolve or disappear in the millennia to come? You hold a small clay tablet in your hand. It fits in your palm, faintly curved, pressed with wedge-like marks. The surface is pale brown, the signs shallow but sharp. You don't recognize the writing, but a scholar would tell you, this is Ugaritic, and in these markings lies the whisper of a revolution. We trace the long-term legacy of the Ugaritic alphabet not through its direct descendants, but through its structural influence, its uncanny similarities to later systems, and its enduring presence as a forgotten pioneer in the history of human expression. A radical simplicity. The genius of the Ugaritic script lies not in its beauty or reach, but in its simplicity. At a time when writing systems across the ancient world relied on hundreds of signs, years of rote memorization, strong state control, sacred association with religion or kingship, The scribes of Ugarit developed a system with just 30 characters. Each represented a single phoneme, the smallest unit of sound. What made this revolutionary? It reduced the cognitive burden of learning to write. It allowed for more people to potentially become literate. It marked the beginning of the alphabetic principle, a profound shift in how language could be recorded. Where cuneiform was a dense web of syllables and ideas, Ugaritic was a streamlined bridge between speech and text. For the first time, written signs closely matched spoken language. Echoes without lineage. Ironically, the Ugaritic alphabet left no direct descendants. It was not passed down to later civilizations. It didn't evolve into Aramaic, Hebrew, or Greek. Instead, it vanished when the city fell. Yet it prefigured the principles of writing systems that would dominate. Phoenician, which simplified the writing of Semitic consonants. Greek, which added vowel markers. Latin, which became the foundation of many modern alphabets. All these later scripts embodied what Ugarit had already tested: fewer signs, phonetic representation, adaptability. So we must ask, was Ugarit an outlier, a coincidence of invention? Or was it part of a broader regional shift, where many began to tire of the bureaucratic burden of older scripts? Some scholars believe Ugarit may have influenced neighboring regions indirectly, through trade routes and scribal exchanges. Others argue its script was developed in isolation, and its similarity to Phoenician is simply a parallel evolution. In either case, the Ugaritic alphabet remains a missing link, a prototype that emerged early, succeeded locally, and disappeared completely. The clay tablet as medium and method. Why did the Ugaritic scribes stick with clay tablets, even as other cultures began using papyrus, leather, or wood? The answer may be partly practical, partly cultural. Clay was cheap, abundant, and durable. Ugarit had scribal traditions rooted in Mesopotamian cuneiform, which was always clay-based. Writing on clay offered permanence, a record that could not easily be erased. But this reliance on clay also limited the alphabet's adaptability. It made it harder to write on the go or on new surfaces. The wedge-shaped signs were optimized for impression, not ink or carving. In the end, it may have been the material limitations of Ugaritic writing, rather than the script itself, that prevented its spread. Still, that same medium preserved the tablets through time. Unlike papyrus, which crumbles, or parchment, which decays, fired clay survives millennia. So while the script died in use, the evidence endured. A glimpse into a vanished world. Beyond the technical marvel of the alphabet, Ugaritic texts offer a window into a cultural and spiritual world now largely erased. The myths written in the script include Tales of Baal, the storm god locked in battle with Mo, the god of death. Stories of El, the high god sitting on his divine mountain. Ritual invocations for fertility, rain, and cosmic order. These stories echo across later traditions. In the Hebrew Bible, where Yahweh battles chaos and commands the waters. In Greek mythology, with its divine feuds and seasonal deaths. In Canaanite religion, which would influence Israelite cosmology. The Ugaritic scribes were not just innovators, they were transmitters of a mythic language that shaped an entire region's thought. And because they wrote phonetically, modern scholars can reconstruct Ugaritic with surprising clarity, pronunciation, grammar, and even poetic meter. The alphabet as equalizer. One of the most profound effects of the alphabet, realized only centuries later, was its democratizing potential. Where cuneiform and hieroglyphs required years of elite training, specialized knowledge of signs and symbols, access to temples or royal courts, the alphabet could be taught to ordinary people. Over time, this shift allowed greater participation in civic life, the rise of personal letters, business documents, and public inscriptions. a move away from the monopoly of writing by religious or royal elites. The Ugaritic scribes did not achieve this democratization in their time, but they pointed the way, demonstrating that writing didn't have to be complicated. It could be efficient, phonetic, and universal. Ugarit's final gift, a memory reclaimed. Today, Ugaritic is a dead language. No one speaks it. No living culture continues its rituals. And yet, it is studied, catalogued, and remembered by scholars around the world. Linguists pore over the Baal cycle. Paleographers analyze the script's form. Historians map the city's connections to broader Near Eastern networks. It is a rare case of a civilization known not through monuments, but through writing, not through conquests, but through the quiet work of scribes. Those scribes, anonymous and forgotten in their time, now receive recognition for having contributed one of the most important structural breakthroughs in writing history. The irony, they left no names behind. Their tablets name gods, kings, and merchants, but the scribes themselves remain faceless. We know their work, but not their identities. And in this, perhaps, is the deepest truth. Writing outlives its writers. The echo in your own hand. If you write today in English, French, Turkish, Swahili, Tagalog, or dozens of other languages, you're using an alphabet, a system that breaks sound into signs, built for simplicity and speed. You are part of a lineage that includes Phoenician traders scratching on wood, Greek scholars writing on papyrus, Roman clerks inscribing stone, medieval monks illuminating parchment, printing press operators, typists, and digital designers. And before all of them, a scribe in Ugarit, seated at a clay desk, stylus in hand, creating something new, not out of genius, but out of necessity. So we close this story with one final question. How many great innovations begin not with ambition or vision, but with fatigue? A tired scribe, overwhelmed by a bloated system, wondering, isn't there a simpler way? And if there is, who will remember that moment 3,000 years later? Story 6. Hieroglyphs and the Scribes of the Nile, Egypt's sacred script. You're seated in the stillness of a stone chamber, buried deep in the cool shadows of a temple. Outside, the midday sun scorches the sands of the Nile Valley, but here, within these thick limestone walls, a man in linen kneels before a wall, carefully carving symbols with a copper chisel. His brow is furrowed in concentration. Each stroke must be exact. Each symbol has meaning. And none of this writing, none of it at all, is meant for you. This is not public writing. It is not writing for communication or record-keeping or the marketplace. It is a kind of magic, reserved for the gods, for eternity, and for the afterlife. This is hieroglyphic writing, the formal script of ancient Egypt, and it may be one of the most beautiful, mysterious, and misunderstood writing systems in human history. The oldest writing of the Nile. By the time Egypt's pyramids were rising around 2600 BCE, hieroglyphic writing was already hundreds of years old. The earliest inscriptions date back to c. 3200 BCE, found on pottery, ivory tags, and ceremonial palettes from Upper Egypt. These early signs evolved rapidly. Soon, they formed a recognizable system. Roughly 700–800 distinct signs in regular use, representing sounds, words, concepts, and grammatical markers. Written in columns or rows and read right to left, left to right, or top to bottom, depending on context. But hieroglyphs were never meant to be efficient. They were meant to be sacred. The Egyptians called their writing medunetur, or words of the gods. To write was to shape the divine. Scribes and sacred power. Scribes in ancient Egypt were not merely clerks, they were guardians of knowledge and cosmic order. To become a scribe, one had to attend a scribal school, often attached to temples or royal offices. Study intensively for many years. Memorize vast numbers of signs, formulaic phrases, and grammatical patterns. Learn to write in multiple scripts, hieroglyphic. hieratic, and later demotic. The elite scribes, those permitted to write informal hieroglyphs, were often priests serving temple rituals, official overseeing royal tombs and inscriptions, monument artisans working with architects and masons to inscribe stone surfaces. They wielded great respect because their work was seen as eternal. Writing for the afterlife. The most common use of hieroglyphs, funerary texts. From the walls of pyramids to the sarcophagi of nobles, from the tombs in the Valley of the Kings to small wooden coffins, hieroglyphs were the language of eternity. They told the stories of the dead, who they were, what offerings they required, which gods they honored, what spells they needed to navigate the underworld. Hieroglyphs were not just records, they were functionally magical. To carve a symbol of a god's name was to invoke that god's presence. To write a spell was to activate its power. That's why so many inscriptions were written in redundant, poetic forms to strengthen their effect. The look of hieroglyphs. Unlike cuneiform or the Ugaritic script, hieroglyphs are pictorial. A seated man for the word man, a lion for the sound L, a loaf of bread for T, a reed for I. But crucially, these pictures did not represent just what they showed. Instead, they had multiple functions. Phonograms, representing sounds or syllables, e.g., owl equals M. Ideograms, representing concepts directly, e.g., sun disk equals day or Ra. Determinatives, silent signs that clarified meaning, e.g., adding a man symbol to indicate a profession. So, for example, to write the word for scribe, you might combine a reed and palette tools of the trade, phonetic signs spelling out sesh, scribe, a man sitting, determinative, showing it's a profession. This layering made the script rich, dense, and highly contextual, a kind of linguistic puzzle only the trained could unlock. Not for the masses. Hieroglyphs were never meant for mass literacy. They were time-consuming to carve or paint, too complex for daily use, reserved for monumental inscriptions, temples, and tombs. For everyday administration and business, Egyptians used a cursive script called hieratic, a simplified version of hieroglyphs written with ink and brush on papyrus. Later still, by around 700 BCE, they developed demotic, an even more shorthand script used in law courts, letters, and trade. But only hieroglyphs retained their ritual function. They were part of the architecture of belief, not bureaucracy. Hieroglyphs and kingship. To be a king, a pharaoh was to be enmeshed in writing. The cartouche, a special oval enclosure around the pharaoh's name, signified divine protection and eternal memory. Pharaohs carved their names on temple pylons, on obelisks, on tomb walls, on colossal statues. To remove a king's name, such as Akhenaten, after his heretical reign, was to erase him from existence. In this sense, hieroglyphs were not neutral tools. They were instruments of state power used to legitimize authority, record divine favor, enshrine victories and building projects, curse enemies and glorify ancestors. But they could also be used to control memory, ensuring some names lived forever and others were deliberately forgotten. Silent in stone. Most hieroglyphic inscriptions were carved into limestone walls, granite obelisks, sandstone temples, wooden sarcophagi. Once inscribed, they were never read aloud again. They were meant for the gods or for the soul of the deceased. They were written speech, frozen in time. In many cases, the person who commissioned the writing may not have been able to read it. The form alone, its presence, its beauty, its tradition was enough. This made hieroglyphs both highly visible and deeply obscure. Everyone in Egypt saw them, few understood them. And so a question. At the end of this section, you now sit back from the tomb wall. The scribe finishes his final line of text, a spell from the Book of the Dead, and lays down his chisel. He knows that few will ever read this inscription, but that's not the point. It's not for people. It's for the afterlife, for eternity, for the gods. And so we pause with a question. What does it mean to write for an audience that will never answer? Can a writing system survive if it is not used to communicate, but only to sanctify? And what becomes of sacred words when belief fades and the language they guard is forgotten? Imagine now that you are walking through the ruins of Karnak. Stone columns tower above you, carved with symbols: birds, eyes, jackals, reeds. The walls of this once glorious temple complex are thick with inscriptions. But here's the strange thing. As you walk, you realize these carvings are not meant to be read by you. They're not even really meant to be read at all, not in the way a modern person reads a sentence or a book. They were created to be seen, believed, and remembered. We explore the functional contradictions of hieroglyphic writing, how a script so elaborate, so public, and so central to Egyptian civilization was also one of the most opaque and restrictive systems of communication in human history. The language of visibility. Egyptian hieroglyphs were omnipresent. On temples, covering every wall and pillar. Inside tombs, lining passageways and sarcophagi. On statues, stelae, coffins, amulets, and papyrus scrolls. But despite this ubiquity, most Egyptians could not read hieroglyphs. Literacy in any form was rare, likely below 5%, and literacy in formal hieroglyphic script was reserved for an elite priestly and administrative class. This was by design. Hieroglyphs were about making power visible. To the gods, to the dead, to the living who could not read, but could still see and feel the script's authority. In this sense, hieroglyphs were a ritual performance, not just a method of record-keeping. Meaning and form, not just sound. Modern alphabets prioritize phonetic sounds matched to symbols, but Egyptian hieroglyphs carried layers of meaning. A symbol of a bird might be read as the sound, or it might represent the idea of flight, or it might be entirely silent and just serve to reinforce the meaning of the word. Many words included determinatives, silent symbols at the end of a word, to specify its category or concept. For example, the word for sun might be written with a sun disk, representing the word itself, plus a phonetic spelling of Ra, plus a determinative showing it was a divine concept. To modern eyes, this is cumbersome, but to Egyptian eyes, it was clarifying. These extra layers of signs gave words nuance, emotion, and ritual resonance. They were not just writing a word, they were giving it life. The role of the scribe. Scribes were at the center of Egyptian administration. They recorded agricultural yields, tax collections, legal cases, royal decrees, temple inventories, funeral instructions. But even scribes mostly used the hieratic script, a cursive form written on papyrus, not carved into stone. Only a small group, temple artisans, elite priests, royal recorders, were trained in formal hieroglyphic carving. These men formed a closed knowledge system, passing skills from teacher to apprentice across generations. They carried an almost mystical status. The god Thoth, deity of wisdom and writing, was their patron. Scribes were often buried with tools of their trade: inkwells, pens, scribal palettes. In the instruction of Amenemop, a scribe is praised as more powerful than a soldier or merchant. To write was to hold knowledge, and knowledge in Egypt was a form of control. Monumental inscriptions, a state project. Almost every major pharaoh undertook massive building projects: temples, obelisks, mortuary complexes, all lavishly inscribed with hieroglyphs. These texts served to legitimize the king's rule, emphasize his divine favor, record victories, real or exaggerated, in battle. declare construction achievements, list offerings and temple dedications. And yet much of this writing was formulaic. Phrases were reused across reigns. Kings plagiarized each other's inscriptions. Sometimes entire stelae were recarved, erasing the name of a previous ruler and inserting a new one. This was less about telling stories and more about fixing memory in stone, projecting power through eternity, even at the cost of truth. Silent letters, eternal life. Hieroglyphs were thought to preserve the soul. In tomb inscriptions, names were carefully written to ensure the deceased's spiritual essence could recognize and return to the body. To erase a name was to kill a soul. This is why enemies of the state were sometimes subjected to damnatio memoriae, a posthumous punishment involving the chipping out of names, the defacement of statues, the removal of lineage from king lists. Without one's name, there could be no eternal life. To carve, then, was to protect. To destroy was to condemn. Hieroglyphs beyond religion. While primarily used in temples and tombs, hieroglyphs also appeared in more personal and pragmatic contexts, though still rare. Amulets with protective texts. Funerary figurines, shapti, bearing spells to activate their labor in the afterlife. Seals used in official documents and property markers. These uses show that hieroglyphs were not entirely walled off from daily life, but they remained anchored to the divine. Even when used on mundane objects, their presence was ritualized. The curse of complexity. The very features that gave hieroglyphs longevity and mystique also led to their eventual decline. Too many signs, over 700 regularly used, and thousands over the full system's history. Heavy reliance on religious and mythological knowledge. Lack of standardization. Spelling could be flexible, even idiosyncratic. As Egypt came under Persian, Greek, and then Roman rule, the use of hieroglyphs gradually narrowed. By the 4th century CE, temples still used the script, but only for decorative and religious purposes. The spoken Egyptian language had shifted far from its Old Kingdom roots. Coptic, a Greek-based script for Egyptian language, emerged for Christian texts. And hieroglyphs, unable to adapt to secular and multilingual communication, faded into silence. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved in Philae in 394 CE. Then the knowledge was lost, preserved but unread. What followed was more than a millennium of mystery. Medieval and early modern scholars saw hieroglyphs as mystical symbols encoding hidden wisdom, magical signs for alchemical or spiritual knowledge, a kind of unreadable riddle, like pictorial poetry. No one could decipher them because their phonetic nature was misunderstood, their grammar was unknown, and crucially, no bilingual key existed, until one was found by accident on a broken black stone near the Nile Delta. But that moment belongs to the next section. And so we leave you with a question. What happens when a civilization forgets how to read its own memory? When words carved in stone, meant to last forever, fall silent? And when belief fades, does the writing it shaped lose all meaning, or does it simply wait to be rediscovered? Now imagine yourself standing before a slab of black granodiorite. It's taller than you, inscribed in 3 bands of writing, one in Greek, one in Egyptian Demotic, and the topmost in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. The year is 1799, and this stone has just been unearthed by French soldiers digging fortifications near the town of Rosetta. They don't know it yet, but this one stone will unravel a mystery that has lasted for nearly 1,400 years. This is the Rosetta Stone, and it will do what centuries of scholars, mystics, and linguists failed to do: unlock the forgotten language of the pharaohs. We explore how hieroglyphs were lost, how they were misunderstood, and how finally they were deciphered, ushering in a new age of Egyptology. The fall into silence. As the last temples fell quiet and Egypt's gods were replaced by newer religions, the purpose of hieroglyphs faded. By the 5th century CE, Christian authorities viewed the ancient scripts as pagan and heretical. Scribes who once knew the language died or abandoned their practice. The written Egyptian tradition shifted to Coptic, which used the Greek alphabet and could be taught within Christian monasteries. Soon, no one alive could read hieroglyphs, not even Egyptians themselves. They became decorations on crumbling monuments, enigmatic carvings that adorned ruins across the Nile Valley. For over a millennium, they sat in silence, misreading the sacred. During the medieval period, Arabic, Persian, and European travelers to Egypt encountered the temples and tombs, but they couldn't decipher the symbols. Instead, they made guesses that hieroglyphs were pure symbols, representing ideas, not sounds. That they were magical emblems, used in rituals and sorcery. That each sign stood for a concept like wisdom or eternity, not a phoneme or a word. One of the most influential voices was Athanasius Kircher, a 17th century Jesuit scholar who believed hieroglyphs contained the divine language of Adam. Kircher published elaborate, imaginative translations of hieroglyphic texts, none of them accurate. But for centuries, these views dominated European thought. The actual phonetic structure of hieroglyphs remained buried until a discovery changed everything. The Rosetta Stone. Found in 1799 near the town of Rosetta, Rashid, by French troops under Napoleon's campaign, the Rosetta Stone was quickly recognized as something important. It bore a hieroglyphic inscription for priestly and religious use, a demotic inscription, a cursive Egyptian script used for daily affairs, a Greek inscription used in the administration of the Ptolemaic rulers. Because Greek was still understood, the stone provided the first direct bilingual translation between ancient Egyptian and a known language. The text itself wasn't glamorous, it was a royal decree reaffirming the divine cult of King Ptolemy V in 196 BCE, but it was written 3 times, in 3 scripts. The decoding could begin. The long decipherment. The task of deciphering hieroglyphs took decades. Key figures included 1. Thomas Young, British polymath, noted that some hieroglyphs inside oval shapes, called cartouches, seemed to spell royal names. Correctly identified some characters as phonetic letters. Realized that demotic was related to hieratic and hieroglyphic forms. 2. Jean-François Champollion, French linguist. Building on Young's work, he took a crucial step. He compared the names Ptolemy and Cleopatra across the stone and other inscriptions. In 1822, he demonstrated that hieroglyphs were partially phonetic, a revolutionary insight. Champollion understood that not all hieroglyphs were symbolic. Many spelled out sounds, especially in foreign names. Using this approach, he began constructing a working alphabet. Over the next decade, Champollion expanded his understanding. Hieroglyphs combined phonograms, ideograms, and determinatives. Egyptian grammar followed predictable patterns. The language had evolved across time, but shared a structure. In 1824, he published the Praecis du Système Hiéroglyphique, laying the foundation for modern Egyptology. Rediscovering a civilization. Once hieroglyphs could be read, Egypt's monuments transformed. Tomb walls that were once mute now spoke of gods, kings, offerings, and rebirth. Temple inscriptions described rituals, calendars, taxes, and land grants. Personal stelae and funerary texts revealed the hopes and fears of ordinary people. For the first time in 1,400 years, Egypt could be heard in its own voice. This was not just about art or religion, it was about social history, economic administration, gender roles, literature and poetry, political propaganda. A new world opened, and it had been written in stone all along. The work continues. To this day, the work of deciphering and interpreting hieroglyphs continues. New tombs and temples are discovered annually. Thousands of ostraca, inscribed pottery shards, offer glimpses into daily life. Digital tools allow scholars to analyze inscriptions at scale. Yet hieroglyphs remain difficult. They changed over time. Old, Middle, and Late Egyptian have different forms. Scribes had freedom in spelling and artistic layout. The same word might appear in dozens of variant forms. But now we have a key, and with it, the words of the past whisper to us again. The irony of immortality. In one sense, the Egyptians were right. Writing is immortality. By carving their language into stone, they outlasted floods, wars, empire, and time. The gods they worshipped have faded. The beliefs they held are gone, but their words, thanks to the efforts of patient scholars, endure. And yet, there's a deeper irony. The writing meant to be most eternal hieroglyphs was forgotten longest. It was not until outsiders, centuries later, pieced together the logic that the inscriptions could live again. The script that once claimed to preserve the soul was itself a lost soul, waiting to be resurrected. A final reflection. Today, hieroglyphs appear on t-shirts, coffee mugs, tattoos. They've become part of pop culture and exotic design. But behind these symbols lies a vast and complex system of thought, one built by scribes working for gods and kings, writing for eternity. The rediscovery of hieroglyphs reminds us of something quiet and profound. Language can die, but it can also be reborn. And sometimes all it takes is a single stone and the patience to listen.